Hello there. If the room around you has grown quieter, if the lights are dim, and the weight of the day is finally beginning to loosen its grip, then tonight we are going somewhere very different. Not to a castle filled with banners and feasts, not to a battlefield echoing with steel, but to something far less dramatic and far more real. A small timber house with a thatched roof in medieval England, standing at the edge of long, narrow fields divided by custom and memory. Before we begin, take a quiet moment and tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. I always find it strangely comforting to imagine these stories drifting across cities and villages, across midnight kitchens and early morning bedrooms, reaching you wherever you are. Tonight, we will not follow kings or queens, nor will we linger in stone fortresses. Instead, we will spend a single ordinary day, as most people once did, the men, women, and children whose names never appeared in chronicles, yet whose hands sowed the grain, repaired the fences, tended the fires, and kept society alive through repetition rather than glory. Imagine waking before sunrise, not because of an alarm, but because cold air presses gently against your skin and faint light slips through a wooden shutter. The room smells faintly of smoke from last night's fire. Outside, mist rests low over the open fields, each strip of land assigned by custom each season, already deciding the rhythm of the day ahead. There is no clock to consult, no calendar marked with personal appointments. Time here is measured by obligation, by weather, by church bells in the distance, by the condition of soil beneath your boots. Life is structured steady and deeply physical. It is not built around ambition, but endurance. So take a slow breath now. Let your shoulders sink a little lower. Allow the noise of the modern world to soften. And as you settle into stillness, step gently into a world where history was not shaped by dramatic speeches, but by ordinary mornings repeated again and again. And tonight, we begin with one of those mornings. Before any door opens in a medieval English village, before smoke rises from a hearth, or footsteps press into damp earth, something already exists that quietly shapes every life within it, the land divided, measured, and remembered according to custom. If you could look down from above, perhaps through the soft haze of early morning mist, you would not see disorder. You would see patterns. Long, narrow strips of cultivated soil stretch outward from a clustered group of timber houses. Beyond them lie open fields, shared pastures, small patches of woodland, and somewhere near the center, a modest church. This is the manor, not simply the residence of a lord, but an entire social framework, a structure of obligation and right that determines how land is held, how labor is given, and how community survives. The manor is not a backdrop, it is the foundation. It does not sit behind village life like painted scenery behind a stage. It shapes the stage itself, defines the positions of the actors, and determines the rules by which they move. Every household within its boundaries belongs to this system in some way, whether through rent, labor inheritance, or shared obligation. No cottage stands beyond its reach. Some families hold land directly from the Lord, under relatively stable terms, their rights defined by charter or long-standing agreement. Others occupy smaller plots with fewer protections and heavier burdens, owing more frequent service or facing tighter restrictions. Yet even these differences exist within the same structure. None stand outside the map. There is no independent farmer cultivating land untouched by manorial custom, no household entirely detached from communal rhythms. The arrangement of land itself enforces interdependence in a way that feels almost deliberate. Instead of a single household owning one continuous block of fields that can be managed in isolation, each family cultivates scattered strips distributed across different sections of the open fields. These strips are long and narrow, measured carefully aligned with those of neighbors, so that plow teams move in coordinated furrows. One strip may lie close to the village boundary, where soil is lighter and more exposed to wind. Another may stretch across heavier ground nearer a stream. A third may sit between the holdings of two other households indistinguishable at first glance, except for subtle boundary markers known to those who work them. This scattering prevents isolation not only socially, but economically. It spreads risk across the landscape. If one portion of the field suffers from poor drainage flooding or exhausted soil, another may yield better results. No family's survival depends entirely on a single patch of ground. Fortune, whether good or bad, is dispersed. The design ensures that no household's prosperity rises or falls without some connection to the fortunes of others. In seasons of abundance, the benefits ripple outward. In seasons of scarcity, hardship is rarely contained within one boundary. The fields, like threads in a woven cloth, bind neighbors together, whether they intend it or not. In this way, the very geography of the manor becomes a quiet instrument of shared fate, reinforcing a reality in which independence is limited and survival is always in some measure collective. At the center of this world stands the Lord of the Manor. He may not always be physically present, and in many villages his face might be seen only occasionally, perhaps during an inspection, a legal session, or the rare moment when he passes through on other business. Yet even in absence, his authority remains unmistakably present, not as a looming shadow cast across doorways, but as a framework quietly woven into daily life. It is present in the way fields are described, in the language used when land changes hands, in the understanding that ultimate ownership does not rest with the tenant who tills the soil, but with the lord whose title frames the entire estate. Legally, the manor exists under his lordship. The land, the rights attached to it, the obligations owed upon it all are defined in relation to him. Even when villagers speak casually of their strips, that possession is conditional, understood to exist within a larger hierarchy of tenure. A portion of that land known as the domain is reserved for his direct benefit. These are not symbolic acres set aside for prestige. They are working fields carefully maintained and integrated into the agricultural cycle of the manor. The domain must be plowed, sown, weeded, and harvested, just like the tenant's strips. But the labor that sustains it does not arise from hired independence. It comes from obligation. Tenants, particularly those of unfree status, owe days of service to cultivate these fields. Their work on the domain is scheduled, expected, and recorded. In this way, legal authority becomes visible in furrows drawn across soil. The grain harvested from the domain may supply the Lord's household, directly filling storehouses that provision his family and dependents. It may also support retainer servants or administrative staff who manage his affairs. In other cases, surplus produce can be sold, transforming agricultural yield into monetary income. The domain, therefore, stands at the intersection of status and sustenance. It converts abstract lordship into material return. Without it, authority would risk becoming symbolic. With it, power feeds itself literally. The domain represents the economic core of his authority, translating legal status into tangible yield. It anchors the manor's hierarchy in something measurable and visible. When tenants walk past those fields, they do not merely see crops. they see the embodiment of obligation. The demesne reminds the community that lordship is not distant theory, but working land cultivated through recognized service, reinforcing a structure that binds field to title and harvest to hierarchy. The remaining land is distributed among tenants, but never detached from the overarching structure of lordship. Each holding exists within a web of obligation. Some tenants pay fixed rents, others owe specified days of labor, and still others combine both forms of service. The arrangement is not arbitrary. It is recorded, remembered, and reaffirmed in the manor court. What sustains this authority, however, is not the constant display of power. The lord does not need to patrol fields daily or issue threats to remind villagers of his position. Instead, his power is embedded in expectation. It lives in the annual cycle of labor dues, in the formal acknowledgement of inheritance in the fees paid upon transfer of land, and in the recognition that ultimate legal ownership rests above individual tenure. Custom gives this structure endurance. Generations of repetition transform obligation into routine. When a tenant performs week work on the demesne, he is not responding to sudden command, but fulfilling an inherited condition of tenure. When a fine is levied for failing to repair a boundary or neglecting a communal duty, it reinforces not only discipline, but continuity. Even disputes, when brought before the manor court, affirm the system's legitimacy by resolving conflict within its framework rather than outside it. In this way, the lord's authority becomes less a spectacle of dominance and more a quiet, persistent presence, visible in parchment records, in field boundaries, in the rhythm of labor owed and acknowledged. It is authority sustained not by constant force, but by shared understanding of how the land and those who work it are meant to function together. Custom in medieval England functions as living law. It governs inheritance, marriage permissions, grazing rights, access to woodland, and labor obligations. It defines who may gather fallen timber and who must repair hedges. It determines how disputes are resolved and how land transfers are recorded. Unlike modern statutory systems, custom is not abstract legislation imposed from afar. It is memory repeated so consistently that it becomes binding. Generations pass down expectations not as theoretical rights, but as known practice. Within this structure exist different social categories. Ordinary people are not a single group. Free tenants hold their land in exchange for fixed rents, often paid in money, or agreed dues. They possess greater legal flexibility and can sometimes transfer holdings with fewer restrictions. Their obligations are clearer and, in some cases, lighter. They are not equals to the lord, but they maintain recognized rights within the system. Villains, by contrast, are unfree tenants. Their holdings come with labor services owed directly to the demesne. They cannot leave the manor without permission, and certain life events, such as marriage outside the manor, may require payment or approval. Yet villains are not slaves in the classical sense. They have houses, families, and recognized plots of land that sustain them. Their status restricts movement, but it also grants structured participation in the agricultural economy. Below them may be cotters or smallholders who possess only a cottage and perhaps a modest garden plot. Their livelihood often depends on supplementary wage labor, seasonal tasks, or service within the manor. The distinctions between these categories matter deeply, but they do not create separate societies. All are embedded within the same fields, the same commons, the same cycle of obligation. The manor court functions as the quiet administrative heart of this world. It convenes periodically to reaffirm custom record land, transfers settle disputes, and impose fines for neglected duties. The proceedings are rarely dramatic. More often they involve clarifying boundaries, noting inheritance, or reminding tenants of obligations owed. Names are written, holdings are described, payments are recorded. Through this repetition, the social map remains intact. The power of the manor lies in predictability. Each tenant understands what is owed and what may be claimed. Labor services, often referred to as week work, require tenants, particularly villains, to work on the domain for a certain number of days. During peak agricultural seasons, additional boon work may be required. These obligations are not arbitrary commands issued in anger. They are expected features of the year built into the rhythm of planting and harvest. In this context, freedom is not measured by the absence of ties, but by the clarity of one's position within them. A free tenant knows his rent. A villain knows his labor dues. A cotter knows the limits of his holding. Stability emerges not from equality, but from defined expectation. The structure distributes responsibility across households, ensuring that the demesne is cultivated and that communal fields are maintained. The open field system reinforces cooperation at a practical level. Plowing requires teams of oxen that many households cannot afford alone. Sowing must occur in coordinated sequences to avoid damaging neighboring strips. Harvest demands collective timing. Even the commons pasture and woodland shared by villagers operate under regulated use. Overgrazing or excessive cutting threatens everyone. Thus, restraint becomes a communal obligation. Children grow into this pattern without perceiving it as unusual. They learn which strips belong to their household. They observe court sessions where elders speak of boundaries and dues. They internalize the structure long before they understand its legal nuance. Identity becomes inseparable from land tenure. To belong to the manor is to inhabit a known place within its hierarchy. Yet the system is not entirely static. Records reveal negotiation and adaptation. In some regions and periods, labor services gradually shift toward monetary payments. Economic pressures reshape expectations. Population changes alter bargaining power. Custom evolves, though often slowly and unevenly. The manor's endurance depends on its capacity to adjust without abandoning its core framework. It would be misleading to imagine this structure as either idyllic harmony or unrelenting oppression. It contains both constraint and cooperation. Authority exists, but so does communal reliance. The scattered strips, the demesne, the commons, and the court all form a web that balances risk and sustains agricultural production. Without this organization, isolated households would struggle to survive environmental unpredictability. As evening falls over the fields, the social map does not disappear. It remains in place beneath the darkening sky. The domain awaits the next day's labor. The strips retain their boundaries. The court records sit quietly, preserving memory. The manor persists not because it is constantly enforced with visible force, but because it has become the assumed order of things. For the ordinary villager, daily thought centers on weather soil tools and family. Yet beneath those concerns lies the map that shapes them all. Land is not merely ground to be worked. It is position. It is obligation. It is belonging. To move a boundary stone is to disturb more than earth. It is to challenge a remembered agreement. The manor, then, is not just an estate. It is governance, localized economy, embodied hierarchy, normalized through repetition. It organizes life without constant spectacle. It binds individuals into a structure that predates them and will likely outlast them. As you imagine that village once more from above, fields laid out like ribs extending from a clustered heart of dwellings, Consider how quietly powerful such structure can be. No dramatic proclamations are necessary. No grand architecture dominates the landscape. The authority of the manor rests in continuity. Year after year, obligation and right repeat themselves until they feel as natural as sunrise. And so, before we step inside houses or follow the rhythm of labor, we pause here at the level of structure. Because without this map, without the manor, nothing else in medieval village life makes sense. The land is already divided. The duties are already defined. The place of each household is already inscribed in custom. The manor holds the village together, and within its boundaries, ordinary lives unfold, steady and enduring, beneath a sky that changes, while the pattern beneath it remains. If the manor is the map, the house is the shelter drawn upon it. After standing in the fields and tracing the invisible lines of obligation, we now move inward towards something smaller, quieter, and far more intimate. Imagine walking along a narrow track of packed earth that curves between cottages. The air carries the faint scent of damp wood and smoke. The houses do not rise high. They do not dominate the landscape. They sit low-built for endurance rather than display. One of them stands before you now. Its frame is timber. Thick oak posts anchor it to the ground, set deep into earth that has been compacted by years of footsteps. Between the beams, panels of woven wattle are coated in daub, a mixture of clay straw and animal dung, smoothed by hand and dried by air. The surface is not perfectly straight. It bears subtle marks of labor. Nothing here is machine cut. Every line follows the rhythm of human hands. The roof slopes steeply and is covered in thatch bundles of straw, layered thickly to shed rain. The thatch is not decorative. It is insulation. It keeps warmth in during winter and deflects water in heavy storms. Over time, it darkens, settles, and must be repaired carefully. The roof breathes with the weather. There are no large glass windows. Perhaps there is a small opening shuttered with wood. Light enters in narrow shafts. The interior remains dim even during the day. Now step closer. The doorway is low enough that you would need to incline your head and bend slightly at the waist before crossing the threshold. That gesture of bowing is not symbolic humility, not an architectural flourish meant to remind you of your place in the world, but a simple concession to physics and survival. A smaller opening holds warmth, more effectively reduces drafts, and limits the force of wind that might push inward during winter storms. Timber frames must remain sturdy, and wide gaps weaken them. In a structure built from wood, clay, and straw, proportion matters. Every beam and panel is arranged to balance strength with economy of material. Even the height of the doorway reflects calculation, though no written formula guided its construction, only inherited understanding of what works and what endures. As you cross the threshold, the air changes almost immediately. Outside, the air may have felt sharp or damp, depending on the season. Inside, it carries weight. It is warmer, certainly, but also thicker, scented faintly with smoke, earth, wool, and the quiet presence of lived-in space. The warmth does not envelop you in comfort as modern heating might. Instead, it radiates unevenly concentrated toward the center of the room. You sense that this warmth has been earned, maintained carefully, and guarded through fuel gathered and burned with intention. The first thing you notice is the hearth. It anchors the room both physically and symbolically, though no one inside would describe it in those terms. It simply is the center. In earlier forms of these houses, the hearth rests directly upon the packed earthen floor a shallow depression lined with stone or hardened clay. Above it, there is no brick chimney, no carved mantel. Smoke rises freely toward the rafters, collecting beneath the roof before filtering slowly through the thatch or escaping through a small vent. The ceiling beams are darkened by years of soot, their surfaces polished in places by rising heat and smoke. The hearth's fire is not merely for cooking. It is for drying garments damp from rain, for warming hands stiff from cold air, for keeping illness at bay, for holding back the quiet threat of frost. Even when no flame leaps upward, embers glow steadily, sustaining a fragile balance between chill and shelter. In many peasant houses of earlier centuries, the hearth sits at the center of the room, directly on the earthen floor. Smoke rises upward toward the rafters, escaping gradually through the thatch or a simple vent. There is no chimney in the modern sense. The interior ceiling is darkened by years of soot beams stained nearly black. This smoke does more than fill lungs. It preserves the thatch. It discourages insects. It slows rot. What seems uncomfortable by modern standards serves multiple purposes in this environment. The floor beneath your feet is not wood planking, but packed earth. It is firm, swept regularly, sometimes layered with rushes or straw that can be replaced when soiled. The ground is cool, solid, slightly uneven. This is not poverty in abstraction. It is practical construction using available materials. Against one wall stands a simple wooden bench, nearby a rough table. These are not identical pieces produced in uniform shapes. They are constructed by local hands, often by the occupants themselves, or by village craftsmen. Wood is precious. Nothing is wasted. Every board is shaped with effort. In the corner perhaps rests a chest. The chest is important. It holds clothing tools or small valuables. In a house with few movable goods, storage becomes protection. The chest can be locked. It marks the boundary between communal space and personal possession. The interior of this house is not divided into many rooms. In most modest dwellings, there is a single main space where nearly everything happens. Work, rest, conversation, mending, warming, and shelter all share the same enclosure. Privacy is minimal. Life unfolds collectively. And yet the house is not chaotic. It has order. Sleeping arrangements may consist of simple wooden frames with ropes or boards supporting straw-filled mattresses. Blankets are layered for warmth. In colder months, animals might be brought into a partitioned section of the house or into an attached byre, their body heat contributing to survival. This arrangement may feel startling to modern imagination, but in a climate where winter bites deeply, shared warmth becomes necessity. Look upward now. The rafters stretch overhead beams, thick and irregular, each one shaped from timber cut nearby. Above them lies the thatch, thick and insulating. In some houses, a loft space may exist where additional storage or sleeping can occur reached by ladder. It is not a separate story in architectural terms, but it expands vertical space. There are no decorative elements here meant purely for display. The beauty, if it exists, lies in function. The curvature of a beam, the way sunlight filters through smoke, the texture of clay walls catching dim light. Silence inside such a house is never complete. Even at night, wood settles with faint cracks. Wind presses softly against thatch. If animals share proximity, their breathing becomes part of the rhythm. The house is alive in subtle ways. Now consider the scale. These homes are not spacious by modern standards. Several people may share a space that today might be considered small, but space is relative to expectation. For those who live here, the house is sufficient because it is aligned with need rather than comfort. Its primary purposes are clear shelter from weather protection from animals and theft storage of essential goods and preservation of warmth. Durability matters. Materials are local. Oak for frames, hazel or similar wood for wattle, clay from nearby ground, straw from harvested grain. The house rises from the same soil that feeds the village. Archaeological studies of deserted medieval villages, places like Warham Percy, reveal foundations and post holes that show how these houses were arranged. The layout was not random. Cottages aligned along lanes, sometimes facing inward toward shared space. Over generations, houses were repaired, rebuilt, modified. They evolved slowly. A house might last decades, but not centuries without renewal. Thatch must be replaced. Daub cracks and is repaired. Timber decays and is reinforced. Maintenance is constant, woven into seasonal tasks. Now imagine evening. The light fades quickly once the sun lowers. Without artificial illumination beyond small oil lamps or candles precious and used sparingly, the house becomes darker than we are accustomed to. The hearth provides glow, casting flickering shadows along the walls. Faces are lit unevenly, features shifting in flame light. Conversations would be close voices low. There is no separate room to retreat to. Shared space reinforces shared existence. The absence of architectural separation does not mean absence of emotional complexity. Within these walls unfold births, illnesses, laughter, arguments, quiet endurance. The house contains the entire range of human experience compressed into limited square footage. During heavy rain, the sound on thatch is steady and intimate. During windstorms, the roof must hold firm. Snow accumulates and weighs downward. Every season tests the structure differently. The house is not insulated from nature. It negotiates with it. In winter, smoke lingers longer inside. Doors remain closed. Warmth is guarded carefully. In summer, doors may remain open longer, air circulating slowly. The rhythm of the house mirrors the rhythm of climate. Now focus on texture. Run your mind along the clay wall, cool, slightly rough. Imagine the scent of straw, the faint sweetness of smoke mixed with earth, the dim glow of embers reflecting off dark beams. This is a world where senses are constantly engaged. Nothing here is abstract. Walls can be touched. Floors can be swept by hand. Repairs require physical effort. Even the smallest change, a new beam, a patched crack, demands time and labor. And yet, despite simplicity, the house provides something essential: continuity. It is the fixed point to which each member of the household returns after working the scattered strips of the manor. It is the space where tools are stored safely, where garments dry near fire, where illness is endured privately. The house may not belong to its occupants in the modern sense of ownership. Tenure conditions tie it to landholding status. But within its walls, daily authority feels intimate. Here, the Lord's domain feels distant. Here, custom softens into habit. Children grow within these walls, learning the feel of timber beams and earthen floors. They memorize the creak of the door. They associate safety with smoke-darkened rafters overhead. When night deepens and the fire burns low, the house settles. Outside, the village quiets, but inside, warmth lingers longer than outdoors. The walls hold heat. The thatch shields against frost. This is not grandeur. It is sufficiency. It is a structure built from available materials, maintained by necessity, shaped by climate and custom alike. And perhaps what is most remarkable is not its simplicity, but its persistence. Across centuries, across countless villages, variations of this house appear again and again. Timber frame, wattle and daub, thatch, hearth, bench, chest. Repetition creates familiarity. Familiarity creates stability. As you rest now and imagine standing just inside that doorway, allow the space to settle around you. The manor outside may define obligation. The fields may demand labor. But here within these walls, the world narrows to warmth, wood, and breath. Tomorrow the door will open again, and cold air will slip across the earthen floor as someone steps out into the gray light of early morning. The latch will lift with a familiar sound. Boots will press into damp soil, and the quiet interior will empty into the wider rhythm of the manor. But for now, the house stands still, gathered inward upon itself. The fire has softened to a bed of embers. The voices that once filled the room have lowered into murmurs, then into breath. Shadows stretch long against the clay walls, and the air, though faintly smoky, carries the warmth that lingers just a little longer than the day. It holds its people without ceremony. It holds them as timber holds weight, simply steadily, without spectacle. Tools rest against walls shaped by repeated use. A wooden bench waits where it was last pushed aside. A chest sits closed, containing garments folded with care. Nothing moves yet. Nothing feels abandoned. The house keeps memory in quiet ways. The smoothed edge of a table worn by hands. The slight dip in the floor where feet have stood. Most often the darkened beam above the hearth bearing the record of countless fires. Above them all, the rafters remain steady beams, darkened by years of smoke, each one set into place with intention and patience. They have endured winters of heavy snow pressing downward and summers when heat dried the thatch overhead. They have listened to storms pass and watched seasons shift through narrow openings of light. They do not announce their strength. They simply carry the weight as they have done year after year, season after season. Let that image remain with you, now the small timber house against the night sky, its thatched roof silhouetted beneath drifting clouds, steady, beneath wind sufficient against cold. Beyond its walls, the fields lie quiet strips, invisible in darkness. The manor rests. The village breathes softly in sleep. And within this modest structure, life is gathered close-held safely for another dawn that will come, as it always does, with the quiet certainty of repetition. Morning in a medieval English village does not begin with a number. There is no bell announcing 6 o'clock in uniform certainty, no ticking mechanism dividing life into identical fragments of measured seconds. Time does not hang framed upon a wall, nor does it rest quietly inside a pocket, consulted and obeyed. It arrives instead as light pale at first, almost uncertain, spreading slowly along the horizon before filtering through narrow wooden shutters. The day begins not because a device commands it, but because dawn appears, and dawn cannot be argued with or delayed. It presses gently but firmly against the edges of sleep until eyes open and bodies stir. If you step outside that timber house we entered last night, the air would feel cool against your skin, even in late summer. The chill is not sharp, but it lingers, carrying the damp scent of soil that has rested through darkness. Mist lies low across the open fields, softening the long, narrow strips into blurred shapes. The ground beneath your boots feels firm, yet moist, holding the memory of night's condensation. Somewhere nearby, an animal shifts its weight, A gate creaks softly. The world does not awaken all at once. It inhales slowly. Other doors begin to open one by one. A figure steps out stretching stiff shoulders. Another follows carrying a tool worn smooth from use. There is no sudden rush into motion, no synchronized start, as though directed by invisible conductor. No one checks the hour before moving. Instead, they read the sky. The faint brightening above the fields tells them what they need to know. Work here unfolds rather than erupts. It gathers momentum gradually like light itself. The village does not snap awake. It loosens from stillness, easing into effort, as naturally as breath returning after sleep. In this absence of mechanical time, the transition from rest to labor feels organic. There is no abrupt break between night and day, only a soft merging. Shadows withdraw slowly. The mist thins. The color of earth shifts from gray to muted brown. Even sound builds gently, the murmur of quiet conversation, the shuffle of boots, the low call used to guide animals from enclosure. The morning carries no urgency beyond what nature dictates. Yet within that calm beginning lies inevitability. The land awaits attention, and the light once risen demands response. In this world, the rhythm of labor is shaped first by season, and only second by the individual day. The year governs everything. Spring brings plowing and sowing. Summer demands tending and weeding. Late summer tightens around harvest. Autumn gathers what is grown. Winter contracts the fields into stillness, but never into complete idleness. A person does not ask what time it is before beginning work. Instead, he asks what the land requires. Soil condition, weather patterns, daylight hours, these become the true measures of time. Experience replaces calculation. Knowledge of the fields lives in the body, in the feel of soil, between fingers, in the resistance of the plow as it cuts through ground, in the sound of wind across stubble. Plowing especially reveals how deeply communal this labor must be. The heavy plow used in many parts of medieval England, built to cut through dense, often clay-rich soil, is not a light instrument that one person can guide behind a single animal. It is weighty, demanding, designed to turn earth deeply enough to prepare it for seed. To pull such a plow requires a full team of oxen, sometimes as many as 8, harnessed in careful arrangement. Few individual households possess enough animals to manage this alone. Oxen are expensive to maintain, slow to mature, and valuable. So, neighbors combine resources. One household may provide 2 animals, another 3 another, the remaining pair. What no one can achieve alone becomes possible through collective strength. This shared arrangement shapes the rhythm of the fields. When a plow team moves forward, it cannot zigzag unpredictably. Furrows must run straight parallel and aligned across the long, narrow strips that define the open field system. A crooked line disrupts not only one plot, but its neighbors as well. The strips lie side by side, sometimes indistinguishable at first glance, except for subtle markers and memory. Therefore, each pass of the plow depends upon coordination, not merely of animals and driver, but of multiple households whose land stretches in sequence. One farmer cannot decide independently to turn early or late without affecting those adjacent to him. The land itself enforces cooperation. Soil condition must be judged collectively. If it is too wet, the heavy plow will clog and compact the earth. If too dry, it will resist and strain the animals. No written schedule dictates the moment to begin. There is no posted announcement declaring plowing commences at sunrise. Instead, understanding grows from shared observation. Men gather at the field's edge, testing the ground with their boots, pressing fingers into the soil, speaking briefly in low voices. Agreement forms quietly. Then the team moves. Once in motion, the work becomes almost rhythmic. The oxen lean into their harnesses. The plowshare bites into earth. Soil turns in long ribbons, dark and damp beneath the surface. Another team follows, keeping distance but maintaining alignment. Across the field, multiple teams progress in parallel, like lines drawn deliberately across parchment. The workday unfolds as an act of synchronized movement rather than isolated effort. No one needs to shout instructions across the entire field. Mutual understanding governs pace and sequence. Experience replaces command. They begin when the soil is ready, not when a clock declares the hour. They continue as long as light allows clear sight and strength holds steady. When shadows lengthen and furrows blur into dusk, they stop, not because a measured minute demands it, but because daylight fades. The sky becomes the clock face, its changing color, the only signal required. In this way, plowing does more than prepare ground for seed. It reinforces the shared rhythm of the community. Each straight furrow is both an agricultural act and a quiet confirmation that no one here works entirely alone. Yet agricultural labor is only one layer of obligation. Interwoven with work on personal strips lies the service owed to the Lord's domain. For many tenants, especially villains, week work forms a structured requirement. Certain days are reserved not for one's own land, but for the Lord's fields. These obligations are recorded, expected, and reaffirmed in the manor court. They are not unpredictable commands shouted across a field. They are embedded conditions of tenure. A tenant knows which days belong to him and which belong to the domain. This does not eliminate strain, particularly during busy seasons, but it does create predictability. During harvest, the balance tightens in a way that can almost be felt in the air. The fields, once green and shifting in the wind, have turned heavy with grain, their heads bowed and golden ready, but vulnerable. This is the narrow window when months of labor either crystallize into security or dissolve into loss. The grain must be cut swiftly before weather turns, before wind flattens stalks into the mud, or rain swells kernels until they rot where they stand. Unlike other seasons, harvest does not allow for gradual pacing. It compresses time. What might have been steady work in spring becomes urgent movement in late summer. At such moments, boon work may be called additional days of labor requested from tenants to secure the crop on the Lord's domain. These are not casual invitations. They are expected contributions during a critical phase. The steward may announce the need, or word may simply pass through the village that the domain fields must be gathered without delay. Yet this obligation does not fall upon a single household. The entire village may gather, forming long lines that move methodically across the fields. Men and women bend with sickles, cutting stalks close to the ground. Others follow, binding sheaves into tight bundles. The rhythm becomes almost unified, a steady progression across land that must be cleared before clouds gather too thickly on the horizon. There is urgency, yes, but it arises from nature rather than abstraction. No one works faster because a bell rings or because an hour has been recorded on parchment. They work faster because the sky darkens, because wind shifts, because distant thunder carries warning. Rain threatens more than missed targets or delayed schedules. A storm can undo months of effort in a single afternoon. Grain beaten flat into wet soil may sprout prematurely or spoil entirely. What once promised bread becomes waste. This knowledge sharpens movement without the need for shouted command. Work intensifies because the sky demands it not, because a clock insists. Bodies move with heightened focus, muscles straining, but steady. Sweat gathers at temples. Breath quickens. Yet even within this intensity, coordination persists. Sheaves are stacked carefully. Paths are left clear for carts. Oxen wait to carry loads once cutting is complete. The urgency is shared, and because it is shared, it does not fracture into chaos. It concentrates into collective effort. Harvest, more than any other season, reveals how closely survival is tied to weather, and how quickly the entire village can shift into a single unified rhythm when the horizon begins to change. Without mechanical timekeeping, labor expands and contracts with daylight. In summer, when light stretches long into evening, work continues until shadows grow heavy and sight becomes uncertain. In winter, when daylight shrinks, tasks adjust accordingly. Outdoor activity lessens, but work does not vanish. Tools must be repaired, harness mended, structures reinforced. Planning happens not on parchment, but in conversation, often by the hearth. The cycle never fully stops, it simply shifts direction. Beyond agriculture, rural labor remains diverse. A medieval village is not composed solely of field hands. Some households spin wool in spare hours. Others weave coarse cloth for local use. Blacksmiths shape iron tools. Carpenters repair frames. Millers grind grain at the watermill. Carters transport goods between manor and market. Smallholders with limited land often depend on wage labor to supplement their holdings. The economy, though grounded in agriculture, contains layers of exchange. The manor structures obligation, but it does not eliminate movement or trade. Within each household, labor divides according to strength, age, and necessity. Children observe before they perform, then gradually assume tasks suited to their ability. Skills are learned through repetition rather than formal instruction. Knowledge transfers quietly, embedded in daily action. There is no written training manual for plowing or hedge repair. The body learns through doing, and memory resides in muscle as much as in mind. It is important to understand that work here is not perceived as a separate category from life. There is no clear division between on duty and off duty. Survival depends upon continuous engagement with land animals and tools. Rest exists, but it arises naturally when darkness falls, when illness interrupts, when winter slows momentum. Leisure, as a defined and scheduled reward, does not structure the week. Instead, there are pauses, a moment to straighten one's back at the edge of a furrow, a brief exchange of words while adjusting harness straps, a shared silence beneath open sky. These are not designated breaks. They are the natural rhythms of a body at work. On days devoted to the domain, tenants gather under the steward's oversight. Attendance may be noted, tasks assigned. The work resembles that done on personal strips, yet the yield belongs to the Lord. In this way, hierarchy becomes visible in the direction of harvest rather than in method of labor. Authority expresses itself through destination of grain rather than through dramatic display. The same soil is turned, the same hands cut sheaves. The difference lies in ownership of result. Without a clock, urgency takes on a different character. It flares when rain approaches, when frost threatens, when harvest peaks. It recedes when fields rest. There is no constant ticking reminder of unfinished tasks extending endlessly into the future. Work belongs to season and daylight. When darkness settles, the day concludes naturally. The absence of mechanical measurement does not create disorder. It creates attunement. People read the sky. They measure progress by completed rows rather than hours spent. Imagine standing at the edge of the field at dusk during harvest. Figures move in measured rhythm, bent slightly, cutting and gathering. The sun lowers, slowly staining the horizon gold. No whistle calls them away. Instead, fading light signals completion. Tools are lifted, oxen guided back. Shoulders ache, but the day feels whole. Tomorrow will bring more labor. Yes, but today's effort has been contained within its own boundaries of light and strength. This form of work shapes perception. There is no anticipation of weekend relief, no countdown to holiday measured in digits. Instead, there is trust in repetition. Spring will return. Harvest will arrive again. Fields will rest and then awaken. Time cycles rather than marches. The manor's obligations, week work, boon work, fit within that cycle, predictable and embedded rather than sporadic. As night falls, the absence of ticking becomes palpable. No mechanism hums in the background. Only wind across thatch-distant animal movement, perhaps the faint crackle of a hearth. The body becomes aware of its own rhythm. Breath, steady muscles, tired, pulse, slowing. Work without a clock does not mean work without structure. It means structure arises from earth-sky, an inherited obligation rather than from gears and springs. And so tomorrow light will come again without announcement. The plow will cut soil. The steward will expect attendance. Fields will respond gradually to labor given. But for now, in this quiet pause between days, there is no second hand sweeping forward. Only the slow turning of the earth itself and the steady endurance of those who work by its rhythm rather than by measured minutes. If work shapes the body, food sustains it. After a day spent in fields or workshops, after labor, measured not in hours, but in daylight and muscle, the question waiting at the edge of evening is not philosophical. It is simple. What will be eaten? What has been stored? What remains in a medieval English village, survival rests heavily upon grain. Grain is not a side dish. It is the foundation. It is the difference between strength and weakness, between continuity and collapse. Fields that stretch beyond the cottages do not merely represent property or obligation. They represent sustenance pressed into seed. Imagine standing once more inside that small timber house. The hearth glows low, not with dramatic flame, but with a steady bed of embers that pulse softly in the dim light. A blackened pot hangs just above them, suspended by an iron hook, or resting carefully upon stones. Steam rises in slow, patient spirals. What simmers within it is likely simple. A pottage thickened with grain, stirred occasionally with a wooden spoon worn smooth from years of use. The scent is earthy and warm, not rich in spice, but grounded, familiar. It fills the room, gradually blending with the lingering smoke in the rafters. Barley, oats, rye, these are the quiet rulers of the medieval table. They do not announce themselves with luxury or novelty. They sustain. Barley thickens soups and stews. Oats soften into porridge when boiled long enough. Rye, hardy and resilient, grows where wheat struggles, and so its presence in bread speaks of practicality rather than preference. Wheat, when available and of good quality, may be milled into finer flour, producing lighter loaves that rise more easily. But for many households, darker, denser bread dominates daily meals. Its texture is firm, its weight substantial. It carries the memory of soil in every bite. Bread here is not a delicacy, not an occasional indulgence brought out for celebration. It is stability shaped by hand. Dough is kneaded without measurement scales, judged by touch and experience. It is baked in communal ovens or simple hearthside arrangements, emerging with thick crusts meant to endure handling and storage. Each loaf represents hours of labor that began months earlier in open fields. To slice into it is to touch the result of plowing, sowing, tending, harvesting, threshing, milling. Grain travels through many hands before becoming bread. When placed upon the table, the loaf does not symbolize abundance, but continuity. It is cut carefully portions measured not by greed, but by awareness of what remains in storage. Stale bread is never discarded lightly. It may be softened in broth, broken into pottage, or reworked into other meals. Waste is unthinkable because bread is not simply food. It is security rendered visible. Each dense slice reassures the household that for this day, at least, the labor of the fields has been transformed into sustenance, and that the quiet cycle of survival continues. The texture would be heavy compared to modern standards. The crumb tight, the crust thick. Each loaf carries the weight of harvest within it. It is cut carefully. Nothing is wasted. Stale bread can be softened in broth. Hardened crust can be reworked. Waste invites hunger. Pottage simmered slowly becomes the evening companion to bread. It may contain grains, peas, beans, onions, perhaps cabbage or leeks if available. The contents change with season and supply. It is not a recipe fixed by measurement, but a response to what can be spared. The pot may remain near the hearth throughout the day, ingredients added gradually. Heat is precious. Cooking is efficient. Protein exists, but it is not abundant daily, and its presence on the table carries weight beyond flavor. Livestock in a medieval village are not merely sources of meat. They are living assets woven into the economy of survival. A cow is more valuable for the milk she yields day after day than for the meat she might provide in a single slaughter. Sheep are prized for wool, their fleece spun and woven into clothing that protects against winter cold. Pigs move through the edges of village life, efficient converters of scraps and forage into flesh. Yet even they represent stored wealth until the moment necessity or season justifies their killing. To slaughter an animal is not a casual act. It is a decision weighed carefully against future need, against the coming winter, against the uncertain promise of next year's harvest. Fresh meat, therefore, appears occasionally rather than routinely. When it does, it may mark a particular moment in the agricultural cycle, such as the late autumn, when colder temperatures allow for safer preservation. At that time, animals not intended to be fed through winter might be butchered, their flesh salted dried or smoked to extend its usefulness. Cuts are divided with intention. Nothing is discarded lightly. Bones may be boiled for broth, fat rendered. Every part carries purpose. In warmer months, meat is rarer, still consumed quickly if available, because without preservation, it spoils easily. Chickens offer a steadier, though modest source of nourishment through eggs. These small, fragile contributions accumulate quietly, adding protein to pottage or bread mixtures. Fish, too, may supplement the diet where rivers, ponds, or coastal waters allow access. Freshwater fish can be caught with simple nets or lines, while coastal communities draw from tidal rhythms. Yet fish-like meat depends on location and season. Availability is uneven, never guaranteed. And through all these fluctuations, grain remains constant. It anchors nutrition not only because it is plentiful relative to other foods, but because it stores travels through winter more reliably and provides the bulk of daily energy. Meat may enrich a meal. Eggs may strengthen it. Fish may vary it. But grain sustains it. The body grows accustomed to its presence. Hunger is measured first by the presence or absence of bread. In this way, protein supplements survival, but grain defines it, forming the steady foundation upon which every other source of nourishment rests. Vegetable gardens near cottages add variety. Small plots yield onions, turnips, beans, herbs. These gardens are modest, yet vital. Their produce softens the monotony of grain and adds nutrients necessary for endurance. Yet even gardens depend upon weather. A poor season reduces more than yield. It reduces resilience. Preservation becomes essential. Without modern storage, food must endure through winter using simple methods. Grain, once harvested and dried, is stored carefully in bins or sacks, protected from damp and vermin. Even slight moisture invites mold. Rodents threaten supply. Storage spaces must remain dry sealed as best as materials allow. Vegetables may be dried. Roots can be stored in cool earth. Salt, where accessible, preserves meat. Smoking near the hearth can extend its life. Each technique extends the harvest beyond its season. Yet preservation is not perfection. Loss remains constant possibility. Now imagine winter settling slowly over the village. The fields that once shimmered with green and gold lie flattened and quiet beneath frost. Furrows harden. Hedgerows stand bare. Snow, when it comes, smooths the land into silence, covering the long, narrow strips until their divisions disappear beneath white. The soil that demanded so much labor in spring now rests beyond reach, locked by cold. Fresh produce diminishes steadily. Garden plots yield little. What remains green grows thin and brittle. The household turns inward, depending not on what can be gathered today, but on what was secured months earlier. The rhythm of eating shifts subtly, but unmistakably. Portions may tighten not dramatically at first, but through quiet calculation. Bread is sliced slightly thinner. Pottage is stretched with more water and fewer additions. Meals grow simpler, relying heavily on stored grain and preserved roots. Variety narrows. The body adjusts as it must to a slower pace and reduced richness. Winter work still exists, but it rarely demands the same caloric output as harvest. The metabolism seems to follow the fields into dormancy. Hunger does not always arrive in dramatic waves of famine. It often creeps quietly as insufficient calories spread across weeks. There may be no sudden empty cupboard, no immediate collapse. Instead, weakness accumulates gradually. Muscles tire sooner. Illness lingers longer. Children feel it first, their growing bodies sensitive to reduction. The elderly feel it deeply, their resilience thinner against cold and scarcity. Food insecurity in this world is not an extraordinary event reserved for catastrophic years. It is a recurring vulnerability that hovers at the edge of every winter. Harvest success determines winter stability more than any other factor. If yields were strong, storage bins feel reassuring. The sight of grain sacks stacked carefully against the wall offers a form of quiet comfort. If weather damaged crops, if rain fell too long, or frost arrived too early, anxiety settles early in the season. Each loaf sliced in winter carries memory of the fields in autumn. Each handful of flour recalls whether the sheaves were abundant or thin. The act of cutting bread becomes a silent reckoning with the past season's fortune. Consider how deeply food binds the village beyond individual households. Grain does not move directly from field to table. It must be milled, and milling requires cooperation as well as structure. the manor mill stands as both tool and symbol. Tenants often are required by custom to grind their grain there, paying a portion as fee for its use. The turning of the millstone transforms hard kernels into flour, but it also reinforces manorial authority. Even sustenance passes through the framework of obligation. The process of turning grain into bread is not entirely private. It intersects with hierarchy, with record, with expectation. Thus, winter reveals not only physical dependence on stored food, but structural dependence on the manor itself. The mill, the storage bins, the careful slicing of bread, all remind the household that survival is shaped by both harvest and system. Food in its most basic form ties land labor and lordship together. It binds neighbors through shared vulnerability and shared infrastructure. And in the stillness of winter, when fields sleep beneath frost and smoke curls steadily from low roofs, the simple act of eating becomes a measure of security, fragile, calculated, and always aware of what remains. The daily act of eating is therefore never fully private. It links household to field, to manor, to hierarchy. And yet within the house, the act of sharing bread feels intimate. A loaf is placed on the table. Hands tear rather than slice with precision knives. Conversation flows softly. Children watch adults distribute portions. The hearth crackles gently. There is no abundance of spices, no layered complexity of sauces. Flavor is simple, shaped by grain root vegetables, perhaps herbs grown nearby. Salt enhances, but must be used carefully. It is valuable. Milk, when available, adds nourishment. Cheese extends milk's lifespan. Butter appears where resources allow. Yet livestock must survive winter too. Decisions about feeding animals compete with feeding people. Now imagine late summer again, when fruit may appear, apples from small orchards, berries gathered from hedgerows. These moments bring sweetness rarely found in winter. Fruit may be dried for later use, but much is consumed fresh. Food variety fluctuates dramatically across the year. The body becomes accustomed to seasonal repetition. Appetite aligns with availability. No one expects strawberries in frost or fresh cabbage in snow. The most fragile point lies in crop failure. If rain persists too long in spring, seeds rot before sprouting. If drought grips summer, grain shrivels. If harvest is cut short by storm, stores shrink. A single bad year strains resilience. Consecutive poor years threaten survival. Without surplus reserves or external supply chains, villages depend heavily on local yield. Trade exists, but not in quantities sufficient to buffer widespread failure easily. The difference between sufficiency and scarcity can hinge on weather patterns beyond control. Yet even in this vulnerability, there is structure. Households ration instinctively. Grain may be stretched through thicker pottage. Meals may become fewer, but more substantial. Livestock may be culled strategically to reduce winter feeding needs. Adaptation occurs quietly. Now return inside the cottage. The pot over the hearth simmers gently. Steam rises in faint curls. Someone stirs slowly, ensuring nothing sticks to the bottom. Bread rests wrapped in cloth. The air smells earthy warm. There is no menu, no written recipe, no calculated nutritional chart. There is only what has been grown, gathered, preserved, and protected. Eating here is not entertainment. It is continuity. Each meal reinforces connection to land. The grain once stood in open fields. The vegetables once grew beside the cottage. The milk came from animals tended daily. Even the salt traveled through trade networks shaped by larger economies. Survival depends upon careful management. Too much eaten, too early in winter, risks hunger later. Too little consumed risks weakness now. Balance is learned through experience rather than instruction. Children grow understanding the value of bread. They learn that crumbs are not discarded lightly. They learn that a full store bin represents security while an empty one whispers uncertainty. Now imagine a quiet evening after a modest but sufficient meal. The body relaxes slightly. Energy returns just enough to sustain tomorrow's labor. The house grows still. The knowledge that grain remains in storage offers comfort beyond flavor. Food here is not indulgence. It is reassurance measured in handfuls of flour and bundles of dried roots. As you let this image settle, notice how deeply food weaves into every other aspect of life we have explored. The manor structures land. Work prepares fields, the house shelters, but food transforms all of it into survival. Without grain, the plow's furrow means nothing. Without preservation, harvest vanishes into winter. Tomorrow, the fields will demand labor again. The steward may call weak work. The plow will cut soil. But tonight, within the small timber house, the simple meal of bread and pottage holds the household steady. Outside, the open fields lie dark. Inside, the hearth glows faintly. Grain rests in storage. Roots lie cool beneath earth. Salted meat hangs carefully. And in that quiet, the difference between life and hardship feels tangible, held in the modest fullness of a wooden bowl. Sats. If food sustains, the body clothing protects it, and in medieval England, that protection is neither decorative nor fleeting. It is deliberate, slow to produce, and built to endure. Imagine once again standing inside that timber house at the edge of the village, early morning light just beginning to soften the darkness near the hearth. A garment hangs nearby, drying gently from yesterday's damp. It is made of wool, thick and slightly coarse beneath the fingers, its fibers uneven in the way only hand-woven cloth can be. It does not gleam. It absorbs light rather than reflecting it. Yet within this simple fabric lies an entire cycle of labor that stretches back through months of patient work. The wool began on sheep grazing beyond the cultivated strips of grain. In late spring or early summer, when the weather warms and fleece grows heavy, the animals are shorn. The shearing itself requires care. The fleece must be removed without damaging the fibers that will later be spun. Once gathered, it is washed often in cold water to remove dirt and lanolin. Then it is dried, teased apart, carded into manageable strands. These strands are not yet thread. They are potential waiting to be twisted into something continuous. Spinning happens in quieter hours. It accompanies winter evenings, pauses between field tasks, moments when hands can move while conversation drifts softly. A spindle turns, fingers draw fibers out and twist them into yarn. Thread gathers gradually wound carefully so it does not tangle. There is no rush. Yarn accumulates over time, almost invisibly, until there is enough to weave. In this way, cloth is not produced in a single burst of effort. It emerges through repetition, through patience. Weaving transforms thread into structure. On a simple loom, the warp threads stretch tight, while the weft passes through them again and again. The motion is steady, the rhythm repetitive. With each pass, fabric grows slowly downward. The resulting cloth is dense and practical. It is not delicate. It is built to resist friction, to survive bending and lifting, kneeling, and walking across uneven ground. The fabric carries slight irregularities, where the hand adjusted tension, where thread thickened or thinned. These are not flaws. They are evidence. From this cloth, garments are cut carefully. Nothing is wasted if it can be avoided. A tunic for a man may fall to the knee, belted at the waist to allow ease of movement. Hose fit close to the legs. A cloak fastens at the shoulder, broad enough to wrap against wind. For women, a long gown layers over an undergarment, perhaps covered by an apron while working. A head covering shields hair from dust and smoke. The shapes are practical rather than ornamental. They are solutions to climate and labor rather than statements of fashion. Color, when present, remains subdued, not because medieval villagers lacked imagination, but because the materials available to them shaped what was possible. Natural dyes derived from plants, bark roots, and minerals produce tones that feel close to the earth itself. Walnut husks lend browns that echo damp soil. Woad carefully processed offers a blue that is soft and slightly muted rather than brilliant. Lichens and certain leaves yield greens that resemble moss rather than emerald. Smoke and repeated washing fade cloth, gradually softening whatever color once appeared more distinct. Sunlight too works quietly upon fabric bleaching and dulling over time. What begins as deeper hue settles into something gentler, worn by weather and wear. Brighter hues, rich crimson, deep purple, luminous scarlet, require not only rare materials, but specialized knowledge and extended processing. Such colors demand resources, trade connections, and technical skill that lie beyond the reach of most ordinary villagers. For those living within the manor's agricultural rhythm, clothing reflects proximity to land rather than distance from it. The tones of earth, field, and animal dominate daily life, and garments mirror that palette. Brown wool resembles the fleece from which it came. Gray echoes the winter sky. Faded blue recalls distant hills softened by mist. Clothing does not announce itself against the landscape. It settles within it. A figure walking across harvested stubble seems almost absorbed by the field cloak and soil sharing similar shade. This blending carries a quiet logic. In a world defined by labor rather than display, garments are not designed to separate the wearer from environment. They participate in it. The muted tones also conceal the marks of work. Dirt, ash, and dust do not stand out sharply against subdued cloth. Practicality shapes appearance without deliberate aesthetic declaration. Because producing cloth requires such sustained labor, shearing, washing, carding, spinning, weaving, cutting, stitching clothing is treated with quiet respect. A tunic is not casually replaced. It represents hours of patient work, and that investment remains visible in how it is maintained. When fabric tears, it is repaired not hastily, but carefully. A small rip near the hem is stitched before it widens. When a seam strains under repeated bending or lifting, reinforcement follows. Thread is drawn through cloth with intention, closing weakness before it spreads. A patch may appear over a worn elbow, shaped precisely to cover thinning fabric. The stitching that secures it is firm and deliberate, each small puncture binding new cloth to old. Over time, multiple patches may accumulate, layering history upon history. These visible repairs do not signify neglect. They signify continuity. The garment continues because someone has chosen to extend its life. Mending is not an occasional interruption. It is woven into daily routine. The needle moves during quiet hours by the hearth, just as the spindle turns. Repair becomes an act of stewardship. Each stitch lengthens usefulness, thread by thread, holding together not only fabric, but also the labor embedded within it. In this way, clothing carries marks of care. A patched tunic does not diminish dignity. It reflects responsibility, patience, and the understanding that material goods once created deserve preservation rather than abandonment. Shoes often made of leather face particular strain. Soles thin quickly against packed earth and rough field stubble. Leather stiffens when wet and cracks if not maintained. Shoes are resoled when possible, stitched again rather than discarded. A well-fitted pair may last years with careful attention. Like wool garments, they mold gradually to the shape of the body that wears them. Clothing functions as insulation in winter. When wind cuts across open fields and frost grips the ground, layers matter profoundly. Wool traps air within its fibers, retaining warmth even when slightly damp. A cloak drawn tightly around shoulders can mean the difference between resilience and illness. Hoods shield ears and neck. Extra layers are added not for display, but for survival. Winter demands adequacy. Without it, the body weakens. In summer, garments lighten, yet protection remains necessary. The weight of winter layers is reduced cloaks set aside. When heat intensifies, sleeves perhaps rolled or made from slightly thinner cloth where means allow. And yet bare skin is rarely exposed without reason. The sun, though welcome after long, cold months, can burn and fatigue. Fields are not smooth expanses. They are edged with hedges lined with brambles, scattered with coarse stalks left behind after harvest. Fabric shields the body from abrasion as much as from temperature. Sleeves prevent scratches from thorns when gathering wood or tending animals. Trousers guard legs against stubble that would otherwise leave skin raw. Even in warmth, clothing mediates between body and environment, standing as a constant barrier that absorbs friction so that flesh does not have to. Because garments must serve across shifting seasons, they are not replaced month by month, but adapted. A heavier underlayer may be removed, a belt adjusted, a cloak folded and stored during warmer weeks. When cold returns, layers are added again. There is no separate wardrobe prepared for each turn of the calendar. There is modification adjustment, layering an economy of fabric rather than an abundance of it. Cloth must flex with climate without multiplying endlessly. The same tunic that shields against chill in spring may endure summer sun, then reappear beneath additional layers when frost settles once more. Continuity outweighs novelty. Within the house, garments are hung near the hearth to dry at the end of long days. Damp from rain or sweat rises slowly as faint steam in the warmth of embers. The scent of smoke lingers in wool, subtle but persistent. Over time, fabric absorbs the atmosphere of the dwelling itself, the mingled smells of ash earth, cooked grain, and timber. A cloak carried outdoors returns each evening to that same familiar air, and gradually it comes to hold it. The rafters above, darkened by years of smoke, have witnessed countless garments lifted onto pegs or draped over beams. They look down silent and unchanged upon generations who have repeated this simple act. In this way, material life accumulates subtle continuity. The gestures remain constant, even as individual hands change. Textiles represent stored labor in tangible form. A wooden chest containing folded garments is more than storage. It is a quiet reserve. Each piece within embodies effort already completed, spinning, accomplished weaving, finished stitching, secured. When harvest is generous, clothing may not draw attention. But in years when crops falter or weather turns against the fields, material goods still hold value. Cloth can be bartered for food. Wool can be traded beyond the village boundary. A well-made cloak may serve not only as protection, but as economic leverage. Thus, textiles extend beyond immediate use. They anchor possibility. They transform labor into something durable, portable, exchangeable. In a world where grain determines survival and land determines obligation, clothing forms a parallel form of security. It does not feed the body directly, yet it protects it from cold and from exposure. It does not grow in fields, yet it grows from labor shaped by those fields. And as garments rest folded within the chest or hang quietly near the hearth, they represent more than fabric. They represent foresight, patience, and the steady accumulation of effort that allows a household to endure beyond a single season. Children inherit clothing as they grow. Sleeves are shortened, tunics altered, fabric repurposed from larger garments into smaller ones. When cloth becomes too worn for wear, it may serve as lining, stuffing, or patch material. Nothing leaves usefulness easily. Waste is minimized not by ideology, but by necessity. Material life in the village extends beyond clothing to tools and household objects. A wooden bowl carved from local timber bears marks of hand tools. A spoon worn smooth from repeated use fits naturally into the palm. An iron knife sharpened countless times serves multiple purposes. Each object is durable, practical, valued. Ownership remains limited in quantity, but rich in meaning. Leather belts secure garments and carry pouches. Bone combs maintain hair. Clay pots withstand heat from the hearth. These items do not crowd the household. They occupy space intentionally. They exist to serve. When morning comes and a villager dresses, the act is unceremonious yet essential. A tunic is lifted from its peg. The wool feels cool at first, then warms against skin. A belt tightens at the waist. Shoes are pulled on, perhaps stiff from previous dampness. There is no mirror consulted for appearance. Clothing prepares the body for work. That is its primary role. Over time, garments conform to the person who wears them. Elbows crease. Shoulders soften fabric. The cloak settles naturally across familiar posture. Clothing and body adapt to one another, each shaping the other subtly. As evening falls again and cloaks are drawn tighter against cooling air, silhouettes form against fading light. Rough wool outlines shoulders. Hoods frame faces turned toward home. There is beauty here, but it is quiet. It lies not in ornament, but in endurance. Not in abundance, but in sufficiency. Inside the timber house, garments are hung carefully once more. The hearth glows low. Tools rest nearby. The chest stands closed, containing folded cloth shaped by many seasons. The material world of the village does not glitter. It persists. And as you allow this image to settle, imagine running your fingers across woven wool, feeling its slight irregularities, sensing the labor woven into every strand. Imagine the steady weight of a cloak resting across shoulders, the familiarity of fabric that has endured weatherwork and time. In medieval England, clothing is not fashion. It is continuity. It is protection shaped slowly by hand. It is labor transformed into warmth. And tonight, as the village grows quiet beneath dark sky, wool hangs gently near the hearth. Leather rests by the door wood, and iron wait for tomorrow's use. The house holds not only its people, but the tangible evidence of their persistence, threads spun patiently, seams mended, carefully garments layered against wind and season alike. In a medieval English village, order does not exist by accident. It is maintained through structure, expectation, and repeated acknowledgement of authority. If the church organizes spiritual life and the fields organize labor, the manor court organizes obligation. The court does not resemble the dramatic halls of later legal tradition. There are no elevated benches carved in grandeur, no elaborate proceedings marked by formal rhetoric. Instead, it often convenes in a practical space, sometimes within the Lord's Hall, if present, sometimes in a designated building, sometimes even in an open area where villagers gather under supervision. It is less theatrical than administrative, yet its authority shapes daily life in ways both subtle and direct. Attendance is not optional. Tenants of the manor are expected to appear when summoned. The steward acting on behalf of the Lord presides. He does not invent rules at will, he enforces custom, and custom in this world carries weight equal to written law. What has been done consistently becomes binding. The manor court records transfers of land. When a tenant dies, his holding does not simply vanish into uncertainty. An heir may claim it, but that claim must be acknowledged. A fine may be paid, terms reaffirmed. The continuity of landholding depends on formal recognition. In this way, the court becomes the mechanism through which generational change is managed, without dissolving structure. Disputes over boundaries are common. In an open field system where strips lie beside one another without fences, clarity depends on memory and markers. If one plow cuts slightly too far into a neighboring strip, the matter may be brought before the court. Witnesses speak. The steward listens. A small fine may be imposed. The goal is not dramatic punishment, but restoration of order. Precision in landholding protects stability. The court also addresses what might appear minor offenses, failure to perform, required labor on the demesne neglect of communal responsibilities, such as maintaining hedges that mark boundaries, repairing pathways used by all, or allowing animals to stray into another tenant's crops. In a society so tightly interwoven, these are not trivial matters. A broken hedge does not simply expose one strip of land. It invites livestock to wander and damage adjacent fields. A neglected pathway slows movement of carts and animals, affecting transport at crucial moments in planting or harvest. An absence from required labor on the domain shifts, burden onto others, increasing strain during already demanding seasons. These infractions are not framed as moral transgressions in isolation. They are disruptions of balance within a shared system. The fine assessed in such cases functions less as punishment and more as recalibration. It signals that an obligation has been unmet and must be acknowledged. The amount may not be crippling, but it reinforces seriousness. Public recognition of the offense matters as much as the payment itself. By bringing the issue into formal record, the court restores equilibrium. The objective is not humiliation or dramatic deterrence. It is maintenance of function. It is important to understand that this legal culture operates within a shared framework that most villagers recognize instinctively. Expectations are not concealed in obscure language or buried within inaccessible documents. They are transmitted through custom, through repetition, through the visible experience of others. A child growing up in the manor observes week work performed regularly, hears of rents due at certain times of year, watches neighbors attend court sessions. Obligation is learned gradually as part of ordinary life. The burdens attached to a holding are therefore not surprises. They are inherited realities. When a tenant accepts land, whether through family succession or formal acknowledgement, he accepts its conditions alongside its advantages. The strip of arable soil offers opportunity to grow grain, but it also carries expectation of service. Week work on the domain rents paid in coin or kind seasonal dues. Participation in communal tasks, these are not arbitrary impositions. They are understood components of tenure. land and responsibility are inseparable. This shared understanding stabilizes the system. Because obligations are widely known, enforcement rarely requires dramatic intervention. Most compliance occurs not from fear alone, but from recognition that the structure benefits continuity. To cultivate land without fulfilling its attached duties would undermine the very framework that allows that cultivation to persist. In this way, legal expectation becomes embedded habit rather than constant confrontation. The manor court reinforces this understanding by repetition. Sessions occur regularly, often several times a year. The rhythm of assembly normalizes accountability. Names are called, attendance noted, fines recorded. The process embeds memory. Authority does not rely solely on force. It relies on predictability. Yet hierarchy remains visible. The steward speaks with delegated power. The villagers respond. Decisions move downward. There is little illusion of equality within this structure. Still, the court does not function as constant oppression. It mediates between lord and tenant in both directions. If a customary right is violated, the tenant may raise complaint. If access to shared resources is obstructed, it can be addressed. Custom protects both sides, though unevenly. Women also appear in manor court records. Widows may claim rights to land. Tenants' wives may be fined for brewing without license or failing to uphold certain duties. The court's reach extends beyond male heads of household. It recognizes households as units embedded in obligation. Fines are typically monetary, though the amounts assessed in the manor court are often calibrated to correct rather than to cripple. A payment signals that an obligation has been breached and must be acknowledged, but it rarely strips a household of its capacity to continue working its land. The system depends on productivity. Extracting so much that a tenant collapses under burden would undermine the manor itself. In this sense, financial penalties function as measured instruments. They reinforce seriousness without dismantling livelihood. Public recognition of the fine, recorded in the court roll and witnessed by neighbors, carries social weight alongside the coin exchanged. Persistent refusal, however, alters the equation. A tenant who repeatedly ignores obligations, failing to appear for required labor, refusing dues, disregarding communal responsibilities, invites escalation. The manor's authority ultimately extends to land tenure itself. Because holdings are conditional rather than absolute property, they can, in principle, be reclaimed. This possibility underlies the structure, even when rarely exercised. Yet such extremes are uncommon. Stability benefits the manor. A dependable tenant who fulfills duties, even imperfectly, sustains agricultural output and predictable revenue. Removing tenants recklessly would leave strips uncultivated, disrupt harvest cycles, and weaken the economic base upon which lordship depends. Enforcement, therefore, tends toward correction before expulsion. The court also manages inheritance with similar pragmatism. Death does not dissolve obligation, it transfers it. When a tenant dies leaving a clear heir, succession is formalized through acknowledgement and often a customary payment. But when no obvious heir exists, uncertainty arises. In such cases, holdings may revert temporarily to the lord. This reversion does not necessarily signal permanent loss. Arrangements can be negotiated. A distant relative may present claim. A widow may assert rights of dower. A new tenant may be admitted under agreed terms. The court provides the procedural mechanism through which these transitions occur. The objective remains continuity of cultivation. Arable land left idle diminishes the manor's productivity and threatens overall balance. Grain must be grown. Rents must be collected. Domain services must be performed. For that to continue, strips cannot lie neglected. The court's intervention ensures that land does not fall into uncertainty for long. Through recognition of heirs, imposition of entry fines, and reassignment when necessary, the system keeps fields under plow and households within defined structure. In this way, inheritance is not merely a private family matter. It is a communal concern embedded within manorial administration. Land passes from one generation to the next, under supervision, its obligations intact. The manor court does not create succession, it formalizes it. By doing so, it preserves both authority and productivity, ensuring that the agricultural landscape remains active rather than fragmented by unresolved claims. Over time, records accumulate. Though many villagers cannot read them, the written rolls maintain institutional memory. Custom becomes documented precedent. What was once remembered orally gains material permanence in ink. The existence of these records strengthens authority by anchoring it in documented continuity. Obligation extends beyond land. Certain services, maintenance of roads, repair of bridges, upkeep of communal structures fall within collective responsibility. The court can compel participation. Shared infrastructure sustains agricultural productivity. Neglect threatens everyone. Yet enforcement rarely requires violence. Social pressure carries significant weight. To be fined publicly, to have one's name called in assembly, creates reputational consequence. In a small village where memory is long, and interaction, constant reputation matters. Compliance preserves standing. The manor court thus functions as a stabilizing mechanism. It translates abstract lordship into concrete administration. It ensures that strips remain cultivated dues, are collected responsibilities fulfilled. It also prevents minor disputes from escalating into lasting division. This does not mean life under manorial law is gentle. Obligations constrain households, especially in years of poor harvest. Fines add burden. Restrictions limit autonomy. Tenants cannot freely sell land as modern property owners might. Movement beyond the manor may require permission. Freedom is structured. Yet within that structure exists predictability. And predictability in an agrarian society vulnerable to weather and disease provides a form of security. Knowing what is owed allows planning. Knowing consequences allows calculation. Consider the atmosphere of a court session. Villagers gather standing or seated informally. The steward calls names from a roll. A neighbor accuses another of allowing pigs to root in his strip. Witnesses confirm. A fine is set. Another tenant seeks recognition of his son as heir. Payment is made. The transfer is recorded. The proceedings are neither theatrical nor emotional. They are administrative, but their cumulative effect shapes every household's stability. The manor court reinforces the idea that land is not isolated possession, but embedded tenure. Rights exist within framework. Use depends on acknowledgement. Authority flows from lord to steward to tenant, but also from custom upward. The system persists because most participants recognize its terms. When the session concludes, there is no dramatic dispersal. Villagers do not leave in agitation or triumph. They step back into the same paths they walked earlier, returning to fields, workshops, kitchens. Tools are lifted again. Oxen are guided forward. Grain continues to be milled at the manor mill. Wool continues to be spun beside hearths. The work that sustains the village does not pause long for legal formality. The court does not dominate daily life constantly. It interrupts it briefly and then recedes. Yet its presence does not vanish with adjournment. It remains embedded beneath routine, shaping how routine unfolds. Each transfer of land, each inheritance acknowledged, each fine assessed, becomes part of the invisible architecture supporting the visible world. Because of this law in medieval England, functions less as dramatic confrontation and more as continuous adjustment. It rarely erupts into spectacle. Instead, it absorbs minor frictions before they widen. A boundary dispute is translated into a small payment. A missed labor obligation becomes a recorded fine. A contested inheritance is resolved through formal recognition. Through these mechanisms, tension is redistributed rather than allowed to accumulate unchecked. Authority does not need constant display because it is reaffirmed through repetition. Custom once recorded and enacted consistently becomes expectation. This system does not erase inequality. The Lord retains rights that tenants do not share. Land is held conditionally. Mobility is limited. Yet within these constraints, the court provides a structured predictability. A tenant knows what is owed. He also knows what protections custom affords him. The framework does not promise fairness in modern terms, but it promises continuity. And continuity in a world vulnerable to weather and scarcity has value. As the village moves through another season, plowing in damp spring soil, sowing seed in measured rows, harvesting beneath uncertain skies, storing grain against winter, the manor court remains an underlying structure. It does not command each movement, but it ensures that land remains assigned responsibilities, recognized dues collected, and disputes contained. Its function is cumulative. Session by session, entry by entry, on the roll, it reinforces a pattern that allows agriculture to proceed without dissolving into private conflict. There is little spectacle in this authority. No grand pronouncements echo across the fields. No elaborate rituals surround each decision. Instead, there is repeated acknowledgement that within this landscape, land is never entirely free of obligation, and obligation never entirely detached from land. Freedom and responsibility coexist, bound together by custom and enforced through modest but persistent correction. The manor court does not define every action, but it frames the conditions under which action takes place. Kaisi. If the manor structures land and labor, the parish church structures time. Imagine standing at the edge of the village just after dawn. The fields stretch outward in long, narrow strips, mist still clinging low to the soil. Behind you rises a small stone building, modest in scale compared to later cathedrals, but solid, deliberate, enduring. Its walls are thick, its windows narrow. The roof, whether thatched or tiled, depending on region, and mean slopes steadily against wind. A simple tower or bell cote may rise above it, not ornate, but visible from nearly every corner of the settlement. This is the parish church. It does not dominate through grandeur. It anchors through presence. Unlike the Lord, who may be absent for long stretches, the church stands continually at the center of daily life. It is visible from fields, from cottages, from the path that leads toward market towns. Its bell, when rung, carries across open land, folding separate households into a single auditory space. The sound does not merely mark an hour, it gathers attention. It calls bodies into shared rhythm. Step closer now. The door is heavy wood, iron-banded, worn smooth where hands have pushed it open across generations. Inside, the air cools immediately. Stone absorbs temperature differently than timber. Light enters through narrow windows, softened and filtered, illuminating dust motes that drift quietly. The interior is simple wooden benches, or perhaps only open space for standing a stone font near the entrance, an altar at the eastern end. Whitewashed walls may carry faint traces of painted saints or symbols muted with time. This building holds more than prayer. It holds memory. Baptism begins life here. An infant carried carefully through that door is received into the parish community at the font. Water touches the forehead. Words are spoken. The child is no longer simply a member of a household, but part of a spiritual network that extends beyond blood ties. Marriage is solemnized before the same altar. Two individuals join their lives publicly, their vows witnessed not only by family, but by neighbors whose presence affirms continuity. And at death, the body returns once more to this place. Burial in consecrated ground surrounds the church. Generations lie beneath the grass that encircles it. In this way, the church binds birth union and death into a single physical space. The same doorway admits each stage of life. Sunday worship structures the week. There is no printed program distributed, no clock regulating the duration of service. Instead, the rhythm of prayer and scripture repeats predictably. Latin words fill the air, even if not fully understood by all listeners. Familiar phrases, gestures kneeling and rising, these become embodied memory. The parish priest may know most villagers by name. His authority differs from the Lord's. It operates through ritual rather than land tenure. The church calendar shapes the year as profoundly as agricultural cycles do. Advent precedes midwinter. Lent prepares for Easter. Feast days punctuate ordinary time with heightened attention. These are not abstract observances detached from daily life. They mark transitions in labor and season. A harvest festival gives thanks for grain gathered safely. Candlemas acknowledges the slow return of light. Saints' days attach stories to specific moments in the year, overlaying sacred narrative upon natural progression. Even those who cannot read encounter scripture constantly, though not through written pages. The interior walls of many parish churches bear painted scenes, saints' biblical narratives, symbolic images that translate theology into color and form. Carvings along wooden beams or stone capitals carry figures and motifs whose meaning is reinforced through repetition. The liturgy itself, spoken week after week, shapes understanding through sound. Latin phrases may not be fully comprehended in grammatical detail by every listener, but familiarity breeds recognition. Tone, cadence, gesture, sequence, these communicate structure and hierarchy of meaning. Over time, repetition inscribes belief not as abstract doctrine, but as lived routine. Faith in this setting is not primarily silent reflection undertaken in isolation. It is enacted collectively. Standing, kneeling, responding, observing, participation embeds conviction. The bell reinforces that collective orientation. Its sound travels farther than sight. When it rings for service, villagers pause, not because a mechanical hour demands obedience, but because the signal has social authority. The rhythm of work adjusts accordingly. Tools are set aside, hands wiped clean. Paths converge toward the church. The bell compresses distance. Fields and cottages momentarily align around a single auditory center. Its tones vary according to purpose. A call to worship carries one pattern, a warning or announcement another. A funeral toll moves more slowly, each strike separated by heavier silence. Without printed notice, villagers learn to read these variations instinctively. Sound becomes language. The churchyard extends this sense of proximity between living and dead. Graves cluster closely around the building, not hidden or segregated at the edge of settlement. Markers are often modest, wooden crosses, simple stones, yet they indicate presence. Names and relationships are remembered, even when inscriptions fade. The dead remain spatially embedded within daily routes. Children pass them on the way to lessons or errands. Adults step across the same ground when gathering for service. Generational continuity is visible underfoot. Memory in this context is not abstract commemoration stored in text. It is geographical. It attaches to specific patches of earth beside the church wall, to familiar positions beneath certain trees, to places where families stand during burial rites. The physical layout reinforces collective identity. The parish is not merely a spiritual jurisdiction. It is a mapped community whose boundaries include both the living and those who preceded them. The church also functions as meeting place. Announcements may be made there, disputes acknowledged, news shared. In a world without widespread written communication, gathering bodies in one space ensures transmission of information. The building serves both spiritual and practical cohesion. Inside during winter breath may appear faintly in the cold air, rising in small clouds that dissolve almost immediately beneath the high beams. Stone walls retain little warmth, and even with bodies gathered close, the interior can feel austere. Worshippers stand wrapped in wool cloaks, fabric pulled tighter around shoulders, hands tucked into sleeves for warmth. The stillness of the building amplifies small sounds, the shuffle of boots against stone, the soft clearing of a throat, the muted echo of the priest's voice carrying through the nave. Light enters sparingly through narrow windows, pale and restrained, illuminating faces turned toward the altar. The chill does not prevent attendance. It becomes part of the experience, reminding the congregation that the church is not designed for comfort, but for constancy. In summer, the same interior feels altered without having changed. Windows admit brighter light, and dust motes drift visibly through sunbeams that fall across the floor. The air grows warmer, carrying faint scents of grass and earth from outside. Cloaks loosen. Children shift more easily in place. Yet the structure itself remains unchanged, same walls, same altar, same font at the entrance. Seasonal variation passes through the building, but the building endures. Its stability contrasts with the shifting fields beyond it. Faith in medieval England does not exist as a separate compartment of life, detached from physical survival. It is not confined to abstract reflection. Prayers are offered for concrete outcomes, for rain at the right moment, for dry weather at harvest, for protection against disease in livestock, for recovery from injury. The concerns brought before the altar are grounded in the realities of agrarian existence. A failed crop is not merely economic misfortune, it is a spiritual anxiety. Illness is not solely bodily weakness, it invites petition. The boundary between sacred and material need remains thin because both occupy the same framework of dependence. Survival depends on factors beyond individual control. Weather disease, fertility of soil, and faith becomes a way of addressing that uncertainty. Petition and gratitude intertwine with the agricultural year. After a successful harvest, thanks are offered publicly. In times of scarcity or illness, intercession is requested collectively. The church does not remove hardship, but it provides language and structure through which hardship can be interpreted. In this way, belief does not replace labor, it accompanies it. The same villagers who plow, sow, and reap also kneel, confess, and pray. Their actions in the field and their actions in the church are not separate identities but aspects of the same existence. The structure remains constant, the seasons shift, and within that interplay, faith becomes one more element woven into the fabric of daily life rather than standing apart from it. Yet belief is not necessarily dramatic or ecstatic. It is steady, repeated, embedded in habit. The Lord's Prayer spoken weekly becomes as familiar as plowing furrows. The sign of the cross marks beginnings and endings. Children learn gestures before they grasp theology. Imagine now an evening service near dusk. The sky outside fades to deep blue. Candles flicker along the altar. Shadows move gently along whitewashed walls. The murmur of voices rises and falls in unified cadence. Outside, fields lie dark. Inside, a different kind of light persists. The parish church provides continuity beyond individual lifespan. The same stones remain as generations pass through. A villager may remember standing beside a parent at this altar, then later standing alone, then eventually being carried out for burial. The building witnesses silently. Even conflict and disagreement find mediation here, not because the church eliminates tension, but because it provides a recognized space in which tension can be addressed without escalating into fracture. In a village where land boundaries overlap and obligations intertwine, disputes are inevitable. Strips of field may be encroached upon by accident or design. Livestock may stray. Promises may be misunderstood. The parish church does not function as a courtroom in the formal legal sense. That role belongs elsewhere, but it operates as a moral center where reconciliation is expected. Oaths sworn within its walls carry particular weight precisely because they are spoken in a setting understood to transcend individual interest. To swear before the altar is to place one's word within a framework that includes not only neighbors, but God. Breaking such a promise risks more than social embarrassment. It risks spiritual consequence. This shared understanding gives authority to spoken commitment. A marriage vow binds not only two individuals, but two families, and by extension, the wider parish. Agreements made publicly within the church acquire a kind of durability because witnesses remember them. The memory of the community reinforces the promise. Authority then rests not solely in written scripture or clerical office, but in collective acknowledgement. The priest articulates doctrine, but the villagers sustain its force by recognizing its validity. Belief becomes social architecture. At the same time, the church does not erase hierarchy. It reflects it, sometimes subtly, sometimes visibly. Seating positions may indicate relative standing within the parish. Those of greater means or local prominence might occupy places closer to the altar or within enclosed pews, while others stand or kneel in less defined space. Burial placement in the churchyard may also reveal status with certain plots nearer the building itself. These distinctions do not disappear simply because worship occurs under one roof. Instead, they are integrated into the structure. Yet hierarchy here operates within shared ritual. All hear the same prayers. All kneel upon the same stone or packed earth. All receive baptism at the same font and burial in the same consecrated ground. The church contains difference without dissolving unity. It acknowledges variation in wealth or influence while maintaining a collective identity grounded in common practice. In this way, the parish church stabilizes social order not by flattening it, but by placing it within a framework that feels coherent and continuous. Now step back outside once more. The bell tower stands against twilight. Smoke rises from cottages beyond. The open fields stretch outward, quiet, for the night. The church remains visible from nearly every direction, its outline steady against the horizon. It does not move. It does not labor. Yet it orders experience through ritual. If the manor organizes land and obligation, the parish organizes memory and meaning. And as darkness deepens and villagers return to their homes, cloaks drawn close, the church remains at the center stone, holding warmth of the day, graves resting beneath moonlight, bells silent until called again. The medieval English village does not exist in isolation. However self-contained it may appear, fields stretching outward, commons regulated by custom manor, court managing obligations, it remains connected to a wider network of exchange. That connection becomes visible most clearly in the market town. Most villages lie within a day's walk of a market center. That distance matters. It determines whether goods can be carried there and back within daylight, whether perishable items such as fresh butter or fish can survive the journey, whether a farmer can sell produce and still return in time to tend animals before dusk. The geography of medieval England is therefore patterned by these small nodes of exchange. Market towns do not dominate the landscape visually, but they anchor it economically. These towns are not large cities in the modern sense. Many consist of a few principal streets arranged around a central marketplace. Timber-framed houses lean slightly toward the road. Workshops open directly onto the street so that labor and trade remain visible. Storage buildings hold grain or wool awaiting sale. A parish church rises nearby, not as the focus of this chapter, but as part of the structural fabric that organizes settlement. On ordinary days, the town may appear subdued, but on designated market days, it changes character. The weekly market does not emerge spontaneously. It is structured by royal or lordly charter. Not every settlement may hold one legally. The right to conduct a market is a privilege granted through formal authority, and it carries both economic and political weight. A charter protects the town's market from unauthorized competition within a specified radius. It establishes the legal day on which trade may occur. It defines who may collect tolls and how disputes are handled. This legal framework matters because markets generate revenue. Tolls are taken from goods brought for sale. Stallholders pay for space. Weights and measures are regulated, and fines may be imposed for violation. Authority benefits financially from the concentration of exchange. Protection of the market is therefore protection of income. For villagers, this legal structure creates predictability. Market day is known in advance and repeated weekly. A farmer plans which goods can be spared from household stores. A trader from another town calculates travel time to arrive before the busiest hours. Predictability reduces risk. If a village produces surplus cheese in early summer, it knows when and where that surplus can be converted into coin. Travel to market becomes routine rather than exceptional. Groups may leave together at first light, following paths worn by generations of use. Carts creak along uneven roads. Pack animals carry bundles of wool or sacks of grain. The journey itself reinforces connection between rural and urban spaces. Villagers do not move aimlessly. They move toward a recognized economic center structured by charter and authority. When they arrive, the arrangement of the marketplace reflects regulation. Stalls are not scattered randomly. Specific goods occupy designated sections. Butchers are placed where inspection is easier. Fish sellers may be separated from dry goods to manage odor and spoilage. Bakers and cloth merchants cluster where foot traffic is highest. This organization enables oversight by local officials responsible for maintaining order and ensuring standardized weights and measures. Standardization is not trivial. In a world where coinage varies and literacy is limited, trust in exchange depends heavily on regulation. Scales are inspected. Measures are compared to approved standards. If a merchant cheats by shortening a measure of grain or diluting ale, penalties may follow. Markets operate on reputation as much as enforcement, and enforcement reinforces reputation. The weekly rhythm of the market integrates surrounding villages into a shared economic circuit. Surplus moves inward. Manufactured goods move outward. Information travels with both. What appears at first glance to be a modest gathering of stalls is in fact a structured system of circulation supported by charter regulation and repetition. On market morning, movement begins early. Farmers bring surplus grain, eggs, cheese, wool, or small livestock. Some carry goods on carts. Others transport them in baskets slung over shoulders. Market exchange does not imply abundance. Many villagers produce primarily for subsistence. What reaches market is limited surplus enough to convert into coin or barter for goods unavailable locally. The layout of the market reflects regulation. Butchers are often grouped together. Fishmongers occupy specific areas. Bakers and cloth sellers cluster in designated sections. This organization is not accidental. It allows oversight. Urban authorities inspect weights and measures. Standardization protects both buyer and seller, at least in principle. Money circulates unevenly in rural England. Coinage exists, silver pennies are common, but many transactions in villages still occur in kind. Rent may be paid partly in grain. Labor services substitute for cash. The market introduces greater monetization. Goods acquire explicit price. A measure of grain equals a certain number of pennies. A yard of cloth commands another. For villagers accustomed to obligation-based exchange, the market represents partial abstraction. Value becomes detached from direct subsistence and translated into currency. Coin allows flexibility. A farmer who sells wool can purchase iron tools, salt, or pottery. Salt, in particular, rarely originates within inland villages. It must be transported. Without market access, such goods remain inaccessible. Urban labor expands beyond agricultural rhythm. In market towns, craft specialization intensifies. Blacksmiths produce tools not only for one village, but for several. Tanners process hides at scale. Weavers operate looms with greater output. Apprenticeship systems begin to formalize skill transmission. A boy leaving a village for town may enter service under a master craftsman, exchanging years of labor for training. London stands apart in scale and complexity. By the high Middle Ages, it functions not merely as a large town, but as a commercial hinge between England and the wider European economy. Its position along the River Thames allows ships to move goods inland and outward with relative efficiency compared to overland transport. The port becomes a point where rural production, regional trade, and international exchange converge. Imported goods pass through its docks in steady flow. Wine from France arrives in barrels, stacked and recorded before distribution. Spices from the Mediterranean, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, move through merchant networks that stretch far beyond England's borders. Fine cloth from Flanders, known for quality weaving, enters urban markets where affluent buyers seek distinction. These commodities rarely reach the average village household directly, yet their presence influences economic patterns nonetheless. London's merchants operate within organized guild structures and legal frameworks that regulate trade at scale. Contracts are written, credit is extended, partnerships are formed across borders. This level of commercial sophistication differs sharply from village barter or even small-town market exchange. Yet the rural world is not detached from it. It supplies raw material. Wool is the clearest example. English sheep produce high-quality fleece, and by the 13th and 14th centuries, wool becomes one of the kingdom's most valuable exports. Bales of fleece are collected, graded, and transported toward ports such as London, Boston, or Southampton. From there, they travel to textile centers in Flanders and northern Italy, where skilled artisans transform them into finished cloth. Rural producers rarely interact directly with international merchants. A shepherd tending flocks in a Midlands pasture does not negotiate with Flemish clothmakers. Instead, intermediaries, local traders, collectors, larger merchants bridge the gap, yet the ripple reaches the countryside unmistakably. Rising demand for wool encourages expansion of sheep flocks. In some regions, land previously devoted to grain begins to shift toward pasture. The balance between arable farming and livestock adjusts in response to external markets. This shift has structural consequences. Sheep require different labor patterns than grain. Pasture can be managed with fewer workers than intensive arable cultivation. In areas where wool profits rise significantly, lords and large landholders may enclose portions of open field or convert strips into grazing land. These changes do not occur uniformly across England, but where they do, they reshape rural priorities. Wool becomes more than fiber. It becomes currency in motion. Taxes levied on wool exports contribute to royal revenue. Political decisions intersect with commercial value. When the Crown imposes customs duties on wool, it acknowledges the commodity's strategic importance. Rural labor, urban trade, and royal finance intertwine through this single product. London's scale amplifies these connections. Its markets accommodate large volumes. Its merchants access foreign credit. Its legal courts adjudicate commercial disputes beyond the capacity of smaller towns. The city's growth reflects not only population increase, but accumulation of transactional complexity. For villagers, these distant structures manifest subtly. A rise in wool prices may encourage increased flock management. A downturn in continental demand may reduce income unexpectedly. External political conflict, war with France, for example, can disrupt trade routes and affect rural producers who never leave their parish. Thus, London operates as a distant but powerful force. It does not erase the village system. It overlays it with wider economic currents. Sheep grazing in quiet English pastures connect through layered networks of trade to looms in Bruges and counting houses along the Thames. The path from field to foreign cloth is long and mediated, yet its existence reshapes the countryside over time. The presence of London and other larger towns such as York or Bristol creates economic gradients. Prices fluctuate. Opportunities differ. A young laborer in a village may see limited advancement within rigid tenurial structures. Urban centers offer wage labor, not security, but mobility. Some leave temporarily, working seasonally in construction or dock labor before returning home. Others remain, integrating into urban guilds. Migration is rarely dramatic mass movement. It is incremental. A younger son without inheritance prospects may seek opportunity in town. A widow with limited land may relocate where domestic service provides income. Rural-urban movement does not sever ties completely. Families maintain connections. Remittances may return in small amounts. Markets also function as information hubs. News travels alongside goods. Political developments, rumors of war, reports of plague outbreaks all circulate verbally. The market integrates social knowledge across regions. It is a node in a communication network long before printed newspapers. Regulation within towns contrasts with village custom. Guilds in larger centers control entry into trades. They establish quality standards and restrict competition. Apprenticeship terms are defined contractually. This formalization differs from village craft transmission, which remains more informal and kin-based. Money changes behavior subtly. When obligations are paid in coin rather than service, relationships shift. Commutation of labor dues, substituting cash rent for week work, becomes more common in later medieval periods. This transition weakens direct labor dependence on domain fields and increases market integration. Tenants gain flexibility. Lords gain liquidity. The system evolves. Yet monetization does not eliminate vulnerability. Price fluctuations affect purchasing power. If grain prices rise after poor harvest, those dependent on buying rather than producing suffer. Urban populations particularly feel scarcity sharply. Rural households producing their own grain retain partial insulation. Markets, therefore, introduce both opportunity and exposure. They allow diversification of income, but also embed households in broader economic currents beyond local control. Urban labor patterns differ from agricultural seasonality. Craftsmen may work year-round, though daylight still limits production. Wages are negotiated. Disputes arise between masters and journeymen. Urban poverty exists alongside commercial growth. Beggars cluster near church entrances. Wealth concentration becomes more visible. For villagers visiting town, exposure to this stratification can be striking. Stone buildings replace timber. Defensive walls enclose streets. Trade goods from distant lands appear on display. The experience contrasts with rural repetition. At the same time, towns depend on villages. Food supply originates in surrounding countryside. Without rural production, urban concentration collapses. The relationship is reciprocal, though unequal in political influence. Transport infrastructure shapes exchange. Roads vary in quality. Rivers serve as major arteries where navigable. Carts move slowly. Pack animals carry goods across uneven terrain. Seasonal weather affects accessibility. Heavy rain turns paths into mud. Winter ice can halt river movement. Even within villages, gradual monetization alters internal dynamics. A tenant who accumulates modest coin reserves gains flexibility, able to pay fines, invest in livestock, or survive temporary shortage without immediate loss of land. Money becomes buffer. Yet most rural households never accumulate significant wealth. Surplus remains narrow. Markets supplement subsistence rather than replace it. The weekly rhythm of market attendance reinforces integration without dissolving village structure. A farmer may spend morning selling produce and afternoon returning to plow. Urban and rural rhythms interlock, but do not merge entirely. Over time, especially after demographic shocks such as plague labor, scarcity strengthens bargaining power of workers. Wages rise in certain sectors. Statutes attempt to freeze pay levels, revealing tension between authority and market forces. Economic change accelerates. Market towns therefore represent dynamic edges of medieval society. They connect enclosed rural systems to expanding commercial networks. They introduce currency specialization, migration, and regulation at scale. The medieval English world cannot be understood through the village alone, nor through the city alone. It is the exchange between them, grain for coin wool, for cloth labor, for wage, that gradually reshapes structure. Through weekly repetition of trade, medieval England becomes economically layered. The manor remains foundational, but markets overlay it with new channels of value. No dramatic revolution announces this shift. It proceeds incrementally. One sale, one apprenticeship, one migration at a time, until money and movement become embedded features of daily life. tea. The medieval English village depends not only on land and market, but on labor structured inside the household. Within that structure, women and children are not peripheral figures. They are essential participants in production continuity and adaptation. Their work is less visible in formal court roles or charters, but it is embedded in daily survival. Domestic production forms the economic backbone of most households. Grain harvested from the fields must be processed before it becomes bread. Wool shorn from sheep must be cleaned, carded, spun, and woven before it becomes cloth. Milk must be churned into butter or pressed into cheese before it can be stored. These transformations occur largely within domestic space, and women direct much of this labor. Spinning is particularly central. Raw fleece arrives coarse and unworkable. It must be washed, dried, teased apart, and drawn into thread using spindle and distaff. This work requires skill and time rather than brute strength. It can be performed alongside other tasks, watching children tending the hearth, monitoring cooking pots. The steady rotation of the spindle converts animal fiber into usable material. Thread accumulates gradually. From thread cloth becomes possible. Weaving may occur within the household if a loom is available, though not every cottage possesses one. A loom requires spaced timber and sustained use to justify its presence. In some villages, weaving concentrates among particular families who have invested in the equipment and developed recognized skill. In others, smaller looms fit within domestic interiors, positioned against a wall where light from a narrow window can fall across the threads. The structure of the loom upright posts, crossbeam, heddles, shuttle transforms, spun thread into structured cloth through repetition and tension, carefully maintained by the weaver's hands and feet. The process is slow and deliberate. Warp threads must first be stretched tightly across the frame. This preparation alone demands time and precision. Uneven tension results in distorted fabric. Once the warp is set, the shuttle passes, weft thread back and forth, each row pressed into place with steady rhythm. The sound of weaving is muted but persistent, the soft thud of the beater, the pull of thread, the shift of foot treadles. Hours accumulate before even a modest length of cloth appears. Textile production consumes significant labor, not only in weaving, but in every stage preceding it. Wool must be sorted by quality, cleaned of debris, sometimes washed and dried. Carding aligns fibers. Spinning converts fiber into usable thread. Only then can weaving begin. A garment embodies weeks of incremental effort. Even coarse cloth represents stored time. Clothing, blankets, sacks for grain, and household linens all depend on this chain of transformation. Fabric serves multiple purposes beyond clothing the body. It insulates against cold lines, storage chests, covers sleeping spaces, wraps infants, and repairs tools. A woven sack protects grain from spillage and contamination. A thick woolen blanket reduces winter vulnerability. Linen cloth, when available, provides cleaner contact against skin. Purchased cloth from market towns exists and may be acquired when coin permits, especially for finer garments or special occasions. Urban weavers produce more uniform textiles, sometimes dyed in richer colors. Yet for most villagers, home production dominates daily use. The majority of garments are functional rather than decorative, designed for durability over display. Because cloth represents concentrated labor, it is treated carefully. Scraps are preserved. Worn sections are cut away and repurposed. A frayed garment may become patch material for another. Textile economy operates on preservation rather than replacement. Each piece of fabric carries memory of work invested long before it became visible clothing. Food processing, similarly, depends heavily on women's work. Grain brought from the manor mill must be kneaded and baked. Ovens vary. Some households share communal ovens. Others bake directly on hearthstones. Brewing ale, a staple beverage safer than untreated water in many contexts, is often female-managed labor. Ale must be brewed regularly because it does not store long. The process requires grain water heat and attention. Dairy production demands daily oversight. Cows must be milked at consistent intervals. Milk spoils quickly. Transformation into cheese extends its usability. Butter production allows storage of fat essential for nutrition. These processes do not pause simply because field labor intensifies. They continue every day. This does not mean men are absent from domestic activity. Rather, labor is differentiated. Plowing and heavy field work fall more often to men due to physical demands. But gendered labor divisions are practical rather than abstract ideology alone. Strength mobility and seasonal timing shape distribution of work. Women also participate in agricultural tasks, especially during harvest. Reaping, binding sheaves, gleaning leftover grain after primary cutting, these activities involve entire households. The distinction between domestic and field labor blurs at peak moments. Property rights for women vary by marital status. Married women operate under coverture, meaning their legal identity merges with that of their husband in many contexts. Yet widows often retain defined rights, including dower use of a portion of land for support after a husband's death. Widows may manage holdings, directly appear in manor court, negotiate rents. Records show their presence in legal proceedings. They are not invisible, though their authority is conditional. Children integrate into this system early. Childhood in medieval England does not unfold in prolonged educational separation from work. From a young age, children contribute. Tasks begin small, fetching water, gathering kindling, tending smaller animals such as chickens or geese. As strength increases, responsibilities expand. Boys often accompany fathers or older male relatives into the fields as soon as they are physically capable of sustained walking and simple tasks. At first, their responsibilities are observational. They watch how oxen are yoked, how a plow is angled to cut soil at the proper depth, how a scythe is sharpened and swung without wasting motion. Gradually, observation turns into participation. A boy may begin by carrying tools or driving smaller livestock. Over time, he learns to recognize when soil is too wet to turn properly, when seed should be broadcast more thinly, when a hedge requires reinforcement before animals press through it. Knowledge is not delivered in formal instruction. It is absorbed through proximity and repetition. Repair work becomes part of that learning. Fence posts rot and must be replaced. Gates sag. Ditches clog. A boy learns how to set a post firmly into earth, how to pack soil to secure it, how to recognize structural weakness before it becomes visible failure. These skills are incremental but cumulative. By adolescence, he may be capable of managing a plow team under supervision, or at least assisting in coordinated labor without constant correction. Girls, meanwhile, observe and practice tasks equally essential to household survival. Spinning begins with imitation. A child may be given coarse fiber to handle before being trusted with finer wool. The mechanics of twisting thread between fingers, maintaining even tension, and winding spun yarn onto a spindle require patience and fine motor skill. Alongside spinning, girls participate in food preparation. They learn how to knead dough to proper consistency, how to judge when ale fermentation has progressed sufficiently, how to monitor milk so it does not sour prematurely. Dairy management involves attention to timing. Milk must be processed quickly, curds pressed properly, storage conditions monitored. These roles are not rigid at every moment. A girl may help in the fields during harvest. A boy may assist with carrying water or tending the hearth when needed. Necessity overrides strict separation. Yet patterns emerge through repetition. Over years, specialization becomes internalized, not through decree, but through familiarity. Education in literacy is limited for most rural children. Formal schooling is rare outside towns' cathedral schools or monastic institutions. A village child is unlikely to encounter structured reading instruction unless attached to a religious house or serving in an urban household where literacy has greater functional value. Written documents, court rolls, charters, parish records exist, but they are mediated through clerks and officials rather than read directly by most villagers. Instead, practical knowledge dominates. Children learn how to measure seed by eye and handful how to calculate roughly how much grain will fill a sack, how to estimate daylight remaining before sunset. They learn to judge weather not from written forecasts, but from wind direction, cloud formation, the feel of air before rainfall. They learn how to stack hay to prevent moisture retention, how to store grain so that vermin do not infiltrate, how to rotate tasks according to season. Survival skills replace abstract curriculum. The ability to interpret landscape, manage animals, preserve food, and maintain tools carries immediate consequence. A child who masters these competencies becomes economically valuable to the household. A child who fails to learn them risks becoming burden rather than contributor. Instruction is therefore continuous, woven into daily activity rather than separated into classroom hours. Apprenticeship provides a structured alternative path for some children, particularly boys, but occasionally girls in certain crafts. A family may send a child to live with a master in a town. The child exchanges labor for training in a trade: blacksmithing, carpentry, tailoring, baking. Apprenticeship contracts specify years of service. During this time, the apprentice becomes part of the master's household. This transition marks a significant shift from rural life. Urban apprenticeship exposes children to monetized labor and guild regulation. It offers upward mobility relative to fixed village tenures, though success is not guaranteed. Completion of apprenticeship may allow entry into guild membership, granting legal right to practice trade independently. Not all children leave. Many remain within agricultural cycle. Inheritance patterns shape prospects. Primogeniture, where the eldest son inherits principal holding limits, land availability for younger sons. Some become laborers. Others seek opportunity beyond village boundaries. Child mortality remains high. Illness, malnutrition, and accident reduce life expectancy significantly compared to modern standards. This reality shapes emotional as well as economic structures. Families invest labor in children early because contribution matters. Childhood vulnerability coexists with expectation of participation. Play exists but integrates with work. Games may involve imitation of adult roles. Physical movement through fields doubles as task and recreation. The separation between work time and child time is far less pronounced than in modern societies. Marriage often occurs earlier than in contemporary Western societies, but later than commonly assumed. Economic readiness influences timing. Establishing an independent household requires resources. Young adults may work as servants in other households before marriage, accumulating experience and limited savings. Women's labor continues through pregnancy and child care. Childbirth interrupts, but does not permanently withdraw women from production. Infants are carried or placed nearby while spinning or food preparation continues. The household structure absorbs these overlapping demands. Domestic authority within the home rests often with the senior woman, particularly in multi-generational households. She coordinates tasks, manages food storage, supervises younger members. Though formal legal power may reside elsewhere, operational control of daily domestic economy is substantial. Gendered expectations also influence moral regulation. Manor courts occasionally record cases involving marital disputes, accusations of misconduct, or disputes over inheritance involving women. These records show that women appear as litigants, witnesses sometimes as offenders. Their presence within legal culture reflects integration rather than marginality. The economic system of the village cannot function without this distributed labor. Grain alone does not sustain life. It must be processed, cooked, preserved. Wool alone does not clothe. It must be transformed. Children do not simply inherit land. They must learn how to operate within its demands. Women and children therefore represent continuity mechanisms. They ensure that skills transmit across generations. They maintain production within domestic space that complements field output. They stabilize households when male laborers are absent due to market travel, military obligation, or illness. Their contribution is not ceremonial. It is structural. At the same time, constraints exist. Legal identity under coverture limits married women's independent contract power. Access to formal education remains restricted. Physical risk during childbirth remains significant. Children's labor exposes them to hazards early. These realities temper any romanticized interpretation. Yet within constraint, adaptation occurs. Widows manage land. Daughters inherit in absence of sons under certain conditions. Female ale brewers operate small-scale commercial production in some towns. Household economies flex around demographic changes. The medieval village is not sustained by men alone, nor by abstract institutions alone. It rests on layered labor distributed across age and gender. When fields are harvested, domestic transformation continues. When markets expand, apprenticeship pathways open. When crisis strikes, households reorganize responsibilities internally before seeking external remedy. In this way, women and children remain central to the functioning of medieval English society, not as symbolic figures, but as active participants in its endurance. The medieval English village is built upon repetition. Plowing follows sowing. Sowing follows preparation of soil. Harvest follows growth, and winter follows harvest. Its stability depends on cycles that assume continuity. Yet continuity is never guaranteed. Periodically, forces beyond coordination and custom intervene. Harvests fail. Disease spreads. Populations contract. Systems designed for steady reproduction of labor and food are forced to confront interruption. Harvest failure represents the most immediate and visible crisis. Agricultural production depends heavily on environmental conditions that cannot be controlled. Excessive rain can waterlog fields and rot seed before it establishes roots. Drought can harden soil so that plows cut shallow furrows and seedlings struggle to survive. A late frost may blacken early growth. Storms close to harvest can flatten grain, making it difficult to cut and increasing the risk of spoilage. Because most rural households operate close to subsistence level, even moderate reduction in yield carries consequence. The first sign of strain appears in storage. Barns do not fill to expected capacity. Grain sacks stack lower. Families begin to adjust consumption gradually rather than dramatically. Loaves shrink slightly in size. Pottage becomes thinner. Ale production may be reduced in order to conserve grain for bread. Livestock feed is rationed more carefully. These measures unfold quietly, often without public declaration. The change is felt rather than announced. If poor harvest affects only one village, neighboring communities may provide limited relief through market exchange. But if crop failure extends across a wider region, grain prices rise. Those who possess surplus hold advantage. Those dependent on purchasing grain suffer first. Coin reserves where they exist may delay hardship, but cannot eliminate it if supply remains scarce. The market does not create food, it redistributes what exists. As winter progresses, the cumulative effects intensify. Malnutrition does not always present as immediate starvation. It appears first as fatigue, reduced physical strength, increased susceptibility to illness. Children weaken more quickly. The elderly struggle to endure cold. When nutritional intake declines over weeks, immune defenses diminish. In this way, harvest failure and disease reinforce one another. Medieval England experiences periods of severe famine. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 illustrates how sustained environmental stress can overwhelm local resilience. Continuous heavy rainfall destroyed crops across large parts of northern Europe. Grain shortages became widespread. Livestock disease compounded loss. Mortality increased significantly. Records indicate rising grain prices and elevated death rates. These years reveal that even structured systems of open field cooperation and commons management have limits under prolonged climatic pressure. Disease introduces crisis in a different form. Unlike failed crops, which are visible in fields, epidemic illness spreads through bodies. The most devastating example is the Black Death, which reached England in 1348. Over the following years, perhaps 1/3 to 1/2 of the population died. Entire households disappeared. Manor court rolls record repeated entries noting vacant holdings because tenants had died. Churchyards expanded rapidly. Labor shortages emerged almost immediately. The demographic shock altered economic relationships. With fewer workers available, surviving laborers found themselves in stronger bargaining positions. Wages increased in both rural and urban contexts. Authorities responded with legislation, such as the Statute of Laborers in 1351, attempting to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and restrict labor mobility. Enforcement varied and was often incomplete, but the attempt itself demonstrates how demographic collapse destabilized established hierarchies. In villages, empty strips required reassignment. Lords faced reduced revenues from rents and labor services. Some domain lands could not be cultivated fully due to insufficient workers. Tenants who survived sometimes accumulated additional holdings when neighbors died without heirs. Land distribution patterns shifted. Marginal lands were occasionally abandoned altogether, reverting to pasture or uncultivated space. The psychological dimension of demographic shock cannot be ignored, though it is difficult to measure precisely. Repeated burial altered communal memory. Clergy shortages affected religious services. Social networks thinned. Yet the institutional framework of the village did not vanish. Manor courts continued to convene. Markets resumed. Fields were plowed again, though sometimes by fewer hands. Structural adaptation often emerged gradually, rather than through deliberate policy reform. Labor services owed to the lord were increasingly commuted into fixed cash payments in many regions. Rather than requiring tenants to perform week work on domain fields, lords accepted rent in money. This shift provided flexibility for both sides. Tenants gained greater autonomy over how to allocate their time. Lords obtained liquidity that could be redirected elsewhere. Over time, such changes contributed to weakening of traditional serfdom in several parts of England. Population decline could paradoxically improve conditions for some survivors. with fewer people competing for land, access to resources per household sometimes increased. Wage labor opportunities expanded in towns and countryside alike. However, this improvement was uneven and dependent on local conditions. Crisis redistributed advantage. It did not eliminate inequality. Not all crises reached the scale of plague or great famine. Localized livestock epidemics reduced dairy and meat supply. Flooding destroyed bridges and roads, disrupting market access. Border conflicts and internal unrest occasionally damaged infrastructure. Each disruption required recalibration rather than reinvention. Commons regulations adjusted to reflect smaller herds. Labor patterns shifted to accommodate reduced manpower. Family structures adapted under pressure. Orphaned children were absorbed into extended kin networks when possible. Widows sometimes remarried more quickly in contexts where labor scarcity increased their economic value. Apprenticeship opportunities in towns expanded when skilled workers were in short supply. Migration between rural and urban areas intensified during periods of imbalance. Crisis did not automatically generate harmony. Economic strain, taxation, and labor restrictions contributed to unrest. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 emerged partly from accumulated frustration over taxation policies and attempts to control wages after the Black Death. Structural resilience therefore coexisted with social tension. Environmental fluctuations continued across centuries. Gradual cooling during the later medieval period shortened growing seasons in some regions. Agricultural systems required incremental adaptation changes in crop selection, improved drainage, modified storage techniques. No single reform resolved vulnerability. Adaptation occurred through layered adjustment. Resilience in the medieval village does not imply absence of suffering. It describes the capacity of structured systems to absorb shock without total collapse. Open field cooperation allowed redistribution of land after demographic loss. Manor courts provided mechanisms for reallocating vacant holdings. Market networks facilitated limited compensation when local harvests failed. Domestic production ensured that households retained some autonomy even when external trade faltered. The endurance of medieval rural society lies in its flexibility within constraint. Systems were restrictive in stable times, but those same systems provided frameworks during instability. Established customs for inheritance tenure and communal obligation allowed continuity even when population numbers shifted dramatically. Over generations, repeated crises reshaped medieval England. Gradual erosion of strict serfdom, expansion of wage labor, increased market integration, and altered landholding patterns were influenced by demographic shock and environmental stress. Crisis acted not as a singular turning point, but as a recurring force that pressed institutions to adjust. The medieval English village was never static. It functioned under pressure. Harvest failure disease and demographic contraction exposed fragility, but they also revealed capacity for adaptation embedded in social structure. The village endured not because it avoided crisis, but because its systems could reconfigure under strain and continue operating. When we step back from the details, fields divided into strips, looms working slowly beside hearths, market stalls, unfolding at dawn, manor courts, recording fines and inheritances. The medieval English village does not appear mysterious or heroic. It appears structured, repetitive, constrained. Its people do not wake each morning seeking self-expression or transformation. They wake because light arrives and work must begin. Daily life is not driven by ambition, but by maintenance. Grain must be grown. Cloth must be spun. Animals must be fed. Obligations must be met. The system survives because it is repeated. Repetition is not monotony here. It is stability. In a world without modern infrastructure, repetition is what prevents collapse. It is important not to romanticize this structure. The village is not an idyllic pastoral refuge. It contains hierarchy. It enforces obligation. It limits mobility. Most people do not choose their status. Land tenure is inherited. Labor expectations are embedded in custom. Opportunity exists, but within boundaries. Yet it would be equally misleading to reduce medieval life to misery. The village does not function for centuries because it is purely oppressive. It functions because it organizes survival effectively within environmental and technological limits. Open field agriculture distributes risk. Commons preserve access to resources. Domestic production ensures resilience. Market towns connect rural life to broader exchange. Even crisis, when it arrives, is met not with total disintegration, but with gradual adaptation. The people within this system are neither passive victims nor romanticized peasants. They are participants in a structure that demands endurance. Children learn work early, not because childhood is denied meaning, but because contribution matters. Women manage domestic economies that convert raw material into usable life. Men labor in fields shaped by shared coordination. All operate within a framework that blends cooperation with hierarchy. What stands out most is not spectacle, but continuity. No dramatic revolution defines most of medieval rural existence. Change occurs slowly through demographic shock, through monetization, through shifting labor patterns, but daily life remains anchored in predictable cycles. This endurance is not glamorous. It is procedural. It is administrative. It is physical. It depends on bodies rising each morning despite uncertainty. It depends on systems that allow land to pass from one generation to the next, even after plague or famine. It depends on shared knowledge that is rarely written down but consistently practiced. The medieval village, therefore, is less a story of romance or ruin and more a study in structural survival. It demonstrates how communities function when technology is limited, when mobility is constrained, and when risk is constant. Its lessons are not inspirational in a dramatic sense. They are instructive in a structural one. If you've stayed with this journey through fields, hearths, markets, courts, and crises, you've seen how daily life was shaped less by extraordinary events and more by ordinary repetition. That repetition built centuries of continuity. If this kind of deep, steady exploration helps you understand history not as spectacle, but as lived structure, you already know what to do. Stay with the channel. Leave a quiet comment about where you're listening from. And next time, we'll step into another world, not to romanticize it, but to understand how it functioned. And now, as the day in that medieval village draws to its quiet end, as the fire settles into a bed of glowing embers, and the wooden door is fastened gently against the cool night air, we step back into the present, carrying something quieter than facts and softer than dates. Perhaps what lingers with you is not the structure of the manor system, nor the layout of open fields, nor even the image of that smoke-darkened house. Perhaps it is simply a feeling, a sense that for most of human history, life unfolded not in dramatic turning points, but in repetition. In cold mornings that felt much like the morning before. In hands roughened by work that had no audience. In shared labor that required cooperation more than recognition. The people of medieval England did not live easy lives, and yet their world possessed a kind of order, seasons that returned bells that marked the hours, customs that structured obligation neighbors who depended on one another whether they wished to or not. That rhythm, steady, predictable, sometimes harsh, allowed communities to endure, even when harvest failed, or illness pass through. If you are listening now, as sleep begins to gather gently around you, you do not need to remember every detail. You do not need to carry the weight of history into tomorrow. Simply rest with the understanding that between the grand events recorded in chronicles were countless ordinary days, and those ordinary days quietly built the foundations of the world we now inhabit. Before you drift fully into rest, let me know where you're listening from. I always read your comments, and I like imagining this small community of listeners spread across the globe, connected by quiet curiosity. And if these slow journeys into the past bring you a sense of calm, you're welcome to subscribe so that tomorrow night we can open another door together. For now, let the fields grow still. Let the village fall silent, and let sleep come slowly, softly, and without urgency.